steel, firearms, and the industrialists crossing into another world. Welcome back, brave explorers of impossible worlds. We are excited to have you here to continue this odyssey together. Before we continue, everything you'll hear is pure fiction. So please don't try to replicate combat techniques at home. This wonderful story in all its rights belong to its brilliant original author. We are only the messengers of entertainment. Want another dose of adventure? Subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss a single chapter. And if you can't wait, our Patreon has exclusive surprises you'll love. Chapter 276 People from the Scholar's Tower. Please have a seat, sir. Thank you, Earl Gleman. The man bowed slightly and gracefully sat down on the sofa. He was a young man with thick glasses, a slightly thin build, and dressed in a simple blue robe. Paul found a familiar feeling in him, proud but not arrogant, self-assured yet polite. Yes, it was the same feeling he had when he first met scholars like Ladisisha or Betty Diosh. He felt a sense of superiority in their gaze, yet couldn't quite pinpoint what it meant. Their demeanor and speech were impeccable, their aura commanded respect. Paul asked, "Scholar Landon, what brings you to the Northwest Bay?" The man introduced himself as Mond Landon, also a scholar. That wasn't unusual. The key was that he came from the Imperial Academy of the Gabella Empire and presented concrete identification. Compared to ordinary scholars, this status was quite different. The Bachelor's Tower in the capital of Gabella, much like Harvard in Paul's previous life, was a first-rate academic institution in the world. In this age of knowledge scarcity, its status was even more unique than the former. Many famous figures in history had studied there, and countless high-ranking officials and even nobles vied to send their children there, hoping to gain a glittering veneer of prestige. Earning the title of bachelor there was even more prestigious. Regardless of whether one was born into nobility, commoner, or even a slave family, as long as one held the title of Bachelor of the Bachelor's Tower, one would be a guest of honor in the courts of various countries. Of course, the Bachelor's Tower had very strict standards for admission. For a rural lord like the former Gleman family, it would have been quite difficult to send someone in. The name of the Bachelor's Tower was renowned even in the Northwest Bay. When the servants reported that such a person had come to visit, he was quite startled. Paul dared not be negligent and treated this guest with utmost care. "Your Excellency is too kind. I haven't even completed my apprenticeship yet, and I'm not qualified to be called a scholar." Hearing Paul address him in such a way, a rare hint of apprehension appeared on Mond's face. Paul smiled and flattered him. "Haha, you'll be one sooner or later, you'll be one sooner or later. I can tell from your hairline that it's already cheering for your bachelor title." Mond's face flushed slightly, a touch of shyness in his expression. "The reason I've come to bother your Excellency is that I have a favor to ask." "Oh?" Paul was surprised. "With the influence of your predecessors or alumni, why would you need to ask me? What use could I be if they couldn't handle it?" "Please allow me to explain, Your Excellency." "All right, then speak." Mond Langdon began his explanation. 10 years ago, my teacher traveled to the Northwest Bay and met a commoner child in a fishing village along the coast. He found the child exceptionally intelligent and decided to take him on as a student. However, his parents were reluctant to let such a young child leave their side, so my teacher made an agreement with them that he would be taken to Gabella to study once he was a little older. Over the past 10 years, my teacher and I have visited him in the Northwest Bay several times and sponsored his early education. I have come this time to take him to the capital of Gabella for further studies." Paul was incredibly astonished. Whose child was so lucky? It wasn't just a matter of good fortune. It was practically a miracle. Although the academy, like the church, claimed to be impartial, reality always differed from ideals. Academic pursuits cost money, scholars needed to eat and drink. Besides the regular grants from the Gabella royal family, they received substantial social donations annually. For various reasons, the vast majority of the institution's members were children of high-ranking officials and nobles. Truly commoners were few and far between. Just because of a brief encounter with a scholar, I can get in? This is truly. Why didn't such a good thing happen to me? Paul feigned surprise. So a remote Northwest Bay has hosted someone as distinguished as your teacher. Do you need my help to find this child? Strange, didn't you come to visit a few times in between? Did they move? Mond Langdon stammered. No, it's just, speak freely, Mond said softly. Your Excellency, this child is currently in your prison, locked in my prison? What's wrong? Has the little brat gone astray? Such a good opportunity and he doesn't cherish it. He's incredibly stupid. Seeing Paul's slightly surprised expression, Mond further explained, Your Excellency, his village has been engaged in salt production for generations, and not long ago, Mond's voice trailed off, but Paul already understood what was going on. What's his name? It's a boy named Kevin. If I remember correctly, he's almost 16, Kevin. Paul repeated the name over and over. He quickly remembered, this kid was ranked very high on the list of 50. The report said he was the direct cause of the riot. Kevin was the first to see through Baden's lie about the so-called war tax, then he encouraged the villagers to confront Baden, and finally even tried to bargain with Baden, offering to not report him in exchange for less taxation. At first, Paul couldn't believe it. Was this level of insight and courage really from a 15-year-old? Now he understood, this kid was indeed extraordinary. Paul smiled knowingly, then asked in a less than friendly tone, Sir, are you trying to get someone out of my cell? It's like this. Paul shrugged. Oh. That puts me in a difficult position. Do you know how much trouble this kid has caused me? His attitude was completely different from his earlier enthusiasm. Mond blushed. I know, it is indeed a difficult request, but please, Lord, spare him this time, considering his youth. Besides, it seems the root of the problem lies with the tax farmers' greed and inhumanity. Kevin's initial actions weren't unreasonable, but the situation escalated beyond his control. I believe the boy was later coerced by others, so he'd already investigated. Sir, regardless of the reasons, and whether he was later coerced, his actions ultimately violated my laws. He could have reported the tax farmer to the Lord's mansion after seeing through his lies. Just because you said so, you released him. Would I appear lax in the eyes of others? What about my authority as a lord? I severely punished that Baden. This, Paul intentionally rubbed his right thumb and forefinger together. Think about it again. What's the logic? This, If releasing him would give me more than I lose, what a bookworm, Paul desperately hinted. Mondel seemed to understand. Count, release him, and you will gain the friendship of the Maester's Tower. Sorry, I've been away on business these past few days. Chapter 277 Science and Technology vs. Heroes and Wise Kings. My lord, release him, and you will gain the friendship of the Scholar's Tower, Mond Langdon said earnestly. Brother, are you kidding me? A hollow promise of friendship to get someone out of my prison? I'd rather have real money. But then again, the Scholar's Tower wielded considerable influence in the courts of various countries. Mond's tutor could decide to take in a commoner with a single word. He must hold a certain position within the tower. This Mond Langdon seemed like an honest and simple man, but his tutor might be another story. I'd heard that the older scholars were all quite eccentric. What if he was overly protective and used his connections to make things difficult for me? Sigh, better safe than sorry. Just release this little brat. What about lax enforcement of the law? What about the Lord's authority? The common people of this era didn't understand any of that. It was all just polite talk. Moreover, upon closer examination, Kevin's only mistake seems to be failing to report Baden's lies to the Lord's mansion after discovering them, instead attempting to blackmail Baden with various conditions. According to the investigation, he neither killed nor robbed after the riot broke out. However, the advice he gave to the salt workers was the direct trigger for the riot, thus placing him on the list of the 50 most serious offenders. Paul, having made up his mind, said seriously, Very well, sir. You can take him, but you'll need to pay bail. Mond Langdon immediately stood up and bowed deeply to Paul, saying gratefully, I thank your excellency on behalf of his parents. The poor couple has been living in constant fear lately. Paul hummed in agreement. You'd better keep a close eye on your junior, make sure he studies hard and doesn't think about anything else. Also, I hope your so-called friendship isn't just empty words. Yes, we will certainly teach him well. Mond hesitated for a moment, then continued, Your Excellency, I heard the Lord's Manor will severely punish 50 major criminals. I wonder what the punishment will be for the others besides Kevin. It's all right to tell you. Of the 20 most serious offenders, 5 will be beheaded, 10 will be hanged, and 5 will have their death sentences suspended. They will be sent to the northern forests to clear land, along with the other 30, to observe their behavior. Kevin was originally going to be sent to clear land as well. Mond bowed to Paul again. You are truly a benevolent lord. He had expected Paul to behead all 50 men. After all, they didn't really rebel. Oh, By the way, what do you misters research all day? Do you have any technical talents, history, politics, literature, music, logic, philosophy, and so on, whatever you can think of? The misters have its treasury. A hint of pride flashed across Mon's face. As for the technical talent you mentioned, if you're talking about mechanics or alchemists, of course we have those. Paul smiled slightly. If you could go back and help me recruit some talent, it would be worthy of the friendship you just mentioned. They don't need to be exceptionally talented, even just being literate would be fine. Of course, I'm referring to Alder. This, Mond Langdon was taken aback, thinking to himself, or the Imperial Academy, after all. I doubt many people would be so foolish as to come to this harsh northwest. However, he still said aloud, I will do my best. After finishing their business, the two continued chatting for a while. Mond Langdon spoke Alder more fluently than Paul, a Gulf native, and there were no communication barriers between them. This scholar truly lived up to the name of the academy. His knowledge was vast, encompassing both ancient and modern times, which secretly impressed Paul. I am working hard to improve people's lives by developing and promoting new technologies, Mr. Scholar. You can wander around Arda, go to the harbor to see our new sailing ships, go to the fields to see our harvesters, go to the shops to see. The young count's ambition surprised Mond Langdon. Aren't the dreams of children this age usually about knightly adventures or leading troops into battle? Paul gestured excitedly, saying, the arrival of 500 angels taught mankind farming, weaving, metallurgy, and blacksmithing, allowing us to occupy the most fertile land in the world. But I believe that science and technological progress are endless. We can definitely improve our lives to another level. We can definitely feed a larger population and ensure everyone has enough to eat. Science? Technology. Yes, I call understanding the principles of things science, and applying science to our lives technology. It is these two that have enabled humankind to develop. Not to boast, but it is precisely because of these two that the lives of the people of Arda and Berdine have greatly improved compared to before. Mond remained non-committal. Your Excellency, forgive my bluntness, but your territory has just... Paul waved his hand, interrupting him. I know what you're trying to say. A group of salt workers lost their livelihoods because of the salt fields, forcing them to take desperate measures. But I must tell you a fact. The salt fields have saved most families a considerable amount of money. Mond looked incredulous. Mr. Langdon, you live in a prosperous place like the capital of Gabella, and you are a scholar of high status in the academy. Naturally, you don't know the hardships of our remote place. The salt workers used traditional methods to boil salt, and the output is really limited, so the market price is high, compared to now, of course. In the past, no one thought salt was expensive because it was always that price. You know, without salt, you won't have the strength to work, so it's a necessity. Although the amount spent on salt each time isn't much, it adds up to a lot of expenses over the years, Paul said proudly. Since the salt works started producing salt in large quantities, the price of salt has dropped like never before, which has saved a lot of money. If you don't believe me, you can go to the street and ask any woman how she feels about the lower salt prices. This, Mond pondered, I believe there must be a better solution that benefits everyone, a win-win situation. Paul shrugged. I believe so too. But we are not gods. Sometimes you have to sacrifice a small number of people to protect the interests of the majority. It can only be described as a trauma of the times. Fortunately, I wasn't one of those sacrificed. Unfortunately, as the lord of a territory, I happened to be the one making that decision. Mond Langdon acknowledged. You're right, Earl. So in this situation, a wise ruler is so important, one who can take care of the vast majority while minimizing the sacrifices. A wise ruler. Yes, Earl Langdon. Mond Langdon's eyes hardened. More than what you call science and technology. I believe the key to improving people's lives lies in heroes and wise kings. Chapter 278 Clash of Two Historical Perspectives. Heroes and wise kings, Paul asked, somewhat surprised. Exactly. Only strong heroes and wise rulers can lead their people to victory. Countless major turning points in history have proven this. Mond Langdon smiled as he shared his opinion, but he quickly noticed Paul's non-committal expression. What? Earl Gleman, do you disagree with this view? Paul smiled and waved his hand, saying, it's not that I disagree, but I'm not a historian, and I don't have my own conclusions on this matter. However, I have heard others speak of a view that is completely opposite to yours. Oh? Please elaborate. Perhaps you could call your view that only heroes and wise kings can lead the people to victory the heroic view of history. Mond nodded. That's a very apt term, Paul continued, and I've heard of a people's view of history from others. This time it was Mond Langdon's turn to be surprised. People's view of history? What does that mean? Paul thought for a moment, and finally copied the sentence verbatim. The people, and only the people, are the driving force behind the creation of world history. To Paul's surprise, Mond's face did not immediately show opposition, but rather curiosity. Where did this view come from? Paul countered. Then how did your heroic view of history come about? Isn't it obvious? The mythological era is vague and lacks reliable historical records, so let's leave that aside for now. Let's take the ancient Gabella Empire as an example. Before its establishment, humanity faced pressure from all sides from various foreign races. It was under the leadership and conquest of Emperor Leon that the greatest empire in human history was born. The brilliant and ambitious Emperor Leon led the human army to resist wave after wave of invasions from the foreign races. Subsequently, the Gabella Empire experienced 5 generations of wise rulers who worked diligently to accumulate overwhelming strength compared to the foreign races. Finally, under the command of many famous generals, led by Leon, humanity began a great counterattack against the foreign races. From then on, orcs fled to the grasslands, dwarves retreated to the mountains, and elves hid deep in the forests. If you study history carefully, you will find that in this process, the human elite represented by Leon and Leon, these admirable outstanding figures, played an enormous role. Without them, we humans would not have our current status, and there would be no such magnificent history. Mond said all this in one breath, and finally emphasized, this is generally accepted in the historical community. Paul nodded. Yes, that's true. I've carefully studied the history of the Gabella Empire and the heroic deeds of those heroes. But have you considered that those heroes merely made the right choices at crucial historical junctures? And those who provided them with so many options were the ordinary people at the bottom of society. Seeing Mond's incredulous gaze, Paul emphasized, I reiterate, I learned this from others. He didn't want to make himself seem too unconventional. Paul continued, the reason the Gabella Empire was able to achieve human unification was that, under the threat of foreign tribes, not only the nobles but also the vast majority of the common people longed for a stronger collective to provide them with protection. Besides the threat of foreign tribes, there were many other important reasons, such as the development of agriculture requiring large-scale engineering projects and the development of commerce opening up extensive roads. However, each power believed it should be accomplished by itself, and Emperor Leon the Great was precisely the most powerful among them, so it was natural for him to complete the unification. Of course, his strength was also inseparable from the support of the people under his rule. The Gabella Empire's counterattack against the foreign tribes and its great expeditions were because the empire was supporting an increasingly large population, inevitably requiring more land to feed them. It wasn't just the foresight of the emperor and his generals, the second sons without inheritance rights and the soldiers eager for wealth also contributed to the great expeditions, even being the main driving force. The entire society developed a desire for expansion, Mond thoughtfully said. This only explains the causes, and many people, including myself, agree with these. But the result, for example, the victory of the expeditions, was determined by the heroes. Paul shook his head. Well, according to the popular view of history, heroes should be secondary. Take the Great Crusade as an example. The main factor determining victory wasn't the outstanding military talent of Leon and others, but rather that the empire could smelt more metal, forge more weapons, produce more food, and build more disciplined armies. Moreover, the centralized system of an agricultural society gave human armies an unparalleled advantage over the loose tribal alliances of other races. In short, all these factors gave human armies an incomparable advantage. Without these, even with divine favor, Leon and others could not have achieved victory. How did these factors arise? Through countless farmers, craftsmen, and soldiers whose names are lost to history. But history only records the names of those in power, and thus wise kings and heroes are born. Mond exclaimed in surprise. This is the first time I've heard such a dismissive view of heroes. No, sir, you're wrong, Paul quickly denied. This isn't about belittling them. Their talents were undoubtedly outstanding, their achievements undoubtedly great, and their names undoubtedly worthy of remembrance. It's just that they are not irreplaceable. From a macro perspective, history seems full of inevitability. Humanity, having mastered advanced technology and achieved a great leap in productivity, will inevitably give rise to a centralized empire. And an increasingly prosperous empire will inevitably generate a desire for expansion. The heroes just happen to be in that position. If it weren't for Emperor Leon the Great, or renowned generals like Elion, their roles would have been played by another group, fulfilling the historical mission bestowed upon them, just as even without his arrival, the Industrial Revolution would have inevitably occurred with the development of productivity. His arrival merely catalyzed this process. Mondl, stiff and wide-eyed, said, "History is inevitable? That sounds like what those charlatans in the church preach. The Lord of Light has already arranged everything." Seeing the other's expression, Paul's vanity was greatly satisfied. He hadn't expected that some random fragments he'd seen online in his previous life would have stunned a scholar from the Maester's Tower. He continued, "Specifically, history, in its macro-level direction, is inevitable. But in specific events, there is a greater element of chance. However, chance only plays a role in accelerating or delaying. The actions of heroic figures can, to some extent, advance or delay the course of history, but they will not change its direction. The dominance of the heroic view of history is also inevitable. Historians will unconsciously revolve their narratives around heroes. After all, limited by the methods of recording, it is impossible to record everyone's name and deeds. Only those who are particularly outstanding and excellent can be recorded. Readers who peruse these historical materials are more likely to empathize with the deeds of heroes and inevitably develop a sense of admiration. But if the historical materials analyze social systems and introduce production relations, they become dry and boring, and many people will skim over them. Mond listened in silence for a long time. He wanted to refute, but then felt that, in some ways, Paul was right. Even so, well, what you said, oh no, this statement has some merit. In the end, Mond had to say this, his worldview had been slightly shaken today. Chapter 279 Unexpected People. Mondl's worldview was indeed slightly shaken, but only slightly. After all, the other party was just a young nobleman who grew up in a remote region. If Paul's words had come from Mondl's mentor, the effect would have been very different. Perhaps his worldview would have collapsed. A novel perspective, Mondl commented. Let me venture to summarize your point. Heroes are merely the implementers of the people's will. Ultimately, it is the common people who determine the course of history. Paul nodded. Exactly, as expected of someone from the Scholar's Tower. Although Mondl didn't entirely agree, the young lord's views on history did have some insight. You really should come back to the Gabella Empire with me. In the Scholar's Tower, Your Excellency would certainly have more room for development. I'm being rather direct, please don't mind. By continuing your research in history, perhaps Your Excellency could establish a new school of historiography. Although the other party repeatedly emphasized that he had heard it from others, Mondl knew that since Paul hadn't named names, he was most likely referring to himself. Me? Haha, forget it. Paul waved his hand sheepishly and laughed. I can read some random books in my spare time, but if you really asked me to immerse myself in scholarly research, wouldn't that kill me? Besides, he had more important things to do back home. Paul preferred looking to the future than looking back on the past. Mond stood up. Well then, Your Excellency, I'm sorry to have taken up so much of your time. I'll take my leave now. He felt it was time to end the conversation. He had achieved his purpose. Kevin's parents were still anxiously awaiting news of their son at home. Not at all, not at all. It was a pleasure talking with someone as learned as you. Welcome to come again. Paul stood up to see him off. He called over a guard and gave him a few instructions. Mr. Langdon, have him take you to the jail to pick up the man. Don't forget to pay the bill. Haha, please rest assured, Your Excellency. Thank you again for your kindness. After exchanging a few more pleasantries, Mond followed the guard out. Just then, a voice rang out from outside. Paul, this is my preliminary coding scheme. Take a look. The melodious voice carried a hint of pride and self-satisfaction. It was immediately clear who it was, and sure enough, the pretty figure of Betty appeared in the doorway the next moment. Then she froze. Mond Langdon, who was walking out and facing her, also froze. Both of them wore expressions of disbelief. Your Highness, Mond was about to blurt it out after a few seconds. Eileen immediately interrupted Mond, her face instantly lighting up with a mixture of surprise and delight, and she said quickly, I never thought Betty Diosh, would meet someone from my hometown here. How did you get here, Senior Mond Langdon? Betty Diosh, Mond muttered softly, completely bewildered, when she saw the other woman give him a wink. He immediately realized what was happening, laughing and scratching the back of his head. "Oh, I didn't expect to run into Betty here. Haha, I'm here to pick up a child my mentor has his eye on." Paul, who had been puzzled by their earlier behavior, suddenly understood. "You two know each other? What a coincidence. Oh, by the way, you're both from Gabella." Mond Langdon addressed Betty as Junior. So this female scholar was also from the academic tower in the Gabella Imperial capital? Wow, I didn't realize I had such a powerful subordinate. This is like a small business owner in a rural town hiring a top student from Tsinghua or Peking University. Paul's gaze towards Eileen instantly changed. Before, he had only regarded her as a noble lady who knew a little about linguistics, and even appointed her as acting education director only because he couldn't find any other suitable candidate. "Yes, we know each other," Eileen explained proactively. "I studied at the Academy Tower and was very fortunate to have the same tutor as Senior Mond." Paul nodded. "I see. So, what about you two now?" He looked at Eileen, then at Mond. Eileen's smile faded, her face returning to the serious expression she had maintained for the past few days. "Business is important. Let me report to you first." Then she turned to Mond. "If you're not in a hurry, Senior, you can wait for me. I'll finish discussing work with the Earl and then catch up with you." Alright, then I'll go for a stroll outside. You can wait for me at the restaurant called Flying Dragon Pavilion, on the street in an hour." Mond responded and walked outside, though he still looked a little dizzy. Eileen then approached Paul and handed him a document. "Your Excellency, please take a look at this draft." Paul's eyes were fixed on the draft, flipping through it while absent-mindedly asking, "I say, Betty, you and him, you mean Mr. Mond Langdon, are you just senior and junior classmates?" Eileen said strangely. "That's right, we're just junior and senior classmates." She suddenly realized Paul was implying something, and two red clouds immediately rose to her cheeks. She said, both embarrassed and annoyed, "Lord Paul Gleman, when did you become so gossipy? Please focus on your work, don't think about such things." Sorry, I'll take a look now." An hour later, Eileen arrived at the Dragon Pavilion. The proprietress, Shara Sisha, greeted her. "Oh, isn't this little Betty? My laddie said you've been very busy these past few days." Since arriving in Lake Town with her daughter, Lady Sisha had returned to her old business, running a restaurant, named after the one she had in her hometown of Messiah, the Dragon Pavilion. The residents of Lakeside Town and the merchants traveling there had never tasted Corner Bay cuisine before. The unfamiliar cuisine, coupled with very affordable prices, made the restaurant incredibly popular. Being roughly the same age, both women, both scholars, both outsiders, and working together at the Lord's Manor, Eileen and Laddie were quite close in private. Eileen often visited Laddie's home, and over time, she also became quite familiar with Shara. Eileen greeted them politely. "Good day, Aunt Sisha," she explained her purpose. "I'm here today to meet a friend, someone from my hometown." She then described Mond Langdon's appearance and attire. "Oh, so the scholar was waiting for you." Shara understood and led Eileen to a private room where a young man in a simple blue robe sat. It was Mond Langdon, who had previously visited Paul. "You two fellow countrymen, please continue your conversation," the proprietress said, closing the door and leaving. "Your Highness, what brings you to the Northwest Bay?" Mond still looked somewhat surprised. Chapter 280 Reminiscing. "Your Highness, what are you doing in the Northwest Bay?" When Mond Langdon saw Eileen again, his face still held a hint of disbelief. He had initially thought what had happened when he left the Lord's Manor was a hallucination. How could the little princess of the Kingdom of Alder be in such a remote place? And, it seemed she was working for the local lord. Hearing Mond's words, Eileen pouted unhappily. "What, Your Highness? Senior, how many times have I told you, just call me by my name? But, here you have to call me Betty." Okay, Betty." Mond awkwardly called her by her current name. Eileen explained why she was there. "I was forced to come here." Forced? What could possibly drive a princess to run away from home? Eileen immediately flew into a rage, hands on her hips, utterly lacking any ladylike manners. "That old man, Rodney's VI, actually wants to marry his youngest daughter to the Duke of the East. Oh, His Majesty the King actually." So she had run away from home, and against the king's arranged marriage no less. Mond was utterly astonished. He hadn't heard of this in the Gabella Empire. It seemed the news had been suppressed. He looked at Eileen with a newfound sympathy. Although they were of different social standing while studying together, Mond had always considered this lively and adorable princess as a younger sister. Sigh. For girls born into royalty, marriage inevitably carries a political dimension. His junior classmate was truly courageous, Mond thought to himself with secret admiration. Come to think of it, had the older royal family really been driven to this point? Thinking of this, Mond felt a pang of guilt and asked, "Could you tell me the details?" "Yes, I was just looking for someone I know to confide in." So Eileen sat down and recounted in detail how she and her guard, Leah, escaped the capital, headed north, and were finally rescued by Paul Gleman after encountering danger in the forest. Perhaps feeling too ashamed, Eileen didn't mention that she had originally planned to go to the Gabella Empire, but due to her terrible sense of direction, she had ended up in the Northwest Bay. Hearing that the female guard named Leah was accompanying Eileen, Mondle breathed a sigh of relief and asked, "Judging from the situation at the Lord's Manor today, Earl Giles still doesn't know your true identity, does he?" "Yes, I'm using the alias Betty Diosh, and I'm staying here as a scholar." "I see. Then, you seem to work at the Lord's Manor." "Yes, as you saw, the Lord's Manor was recruiting when I arrived, so I applied. Initially, I was a consultant, but later Earl Giles appointed me to oversee education." "Education? I didn't expect this young lord to value that so much." "Yes. That's one of the things I admire about him. In the North, and even throughout Alder, there aren't many lords who understand the significance of this." "How?" Eileen, cough. "Betty, it's not that they don't understand, but it's not a good thing for the common people to know too much." "All right. Stop." Eileen pushed forward with both hands. "I have no interest in those so-called arts of domination. Let me tell you, I've already established 6 schools. Of course, they're still very basic. My ultimate goal is for everyone in this land to be literate." Eileen's face was full of pride as she spoke the last part. "That's a daunting task," Mond said, but inwardly shook his head. What was that lord thinking? Allowing the little princess to act so recklessly, was he blinded by Eileen's beauty? "By the way, how is teacher's health? And how did you get here?" "Mond, teacher is in good health. I came here to take away a child who was recognized by teacher a long time ago." "Haha, you'll soon have another junior." Eileen's face lit up with surprise. "Teacher has been here before? What a lucky child. What's his name? Which village is he from?" "I know all the place names here by heart." Mond then introduced Kevin to her, and how he almost got exiled to the northern forests to clear wasteland. "He's truly a lucky child." Eileen sighed again. If it had been any later, perhaps he would have had to go to the great forest to the north. Eileen then asked, "So, how is my cousin, His Highness?" "Well, our eastern neighbors are getting restless again. His Highness led his army to deal with them." Eileen was both surprised and worried, and asked nervously, "My cousin won't be in danger, will he?" Mond laughed and said, "Haha, don't worry. Putting aside the fact that Gabbara's army is incredibly powerful, with His Highness's abilities alone, he'll be safe and sound." Sigh. Eileen was still a little worried. Damn war, it's everywhere. There's fighting in the south, fighting in the north, and fighting in the east. Mond suddenly thought of something and asked, "Are you safe here? I heard that Earl Gleman and several other lords seem to be at war with the current Duke of the Northwest." "It's very safe," Eileen said confidently. As a high-ranking member of the State Council, she naturally knew the strength of the Arda army. They were more than capable of protecting themselves in the Northwest. Mond reminded him, "In short, reveal your true identity when necessary." "I will." "Eileen," Mond whispered the little princess's real name, a look of shame on his face. Seeing her like this, Eileen was very puzzled. "What's wrong, senior?" Mond hesitated and said, "If it's for a noble goal that despicable means are used, what do you think of that?" Why was her senior asking such a question out of the blue? But Eileen quickly replied, "From an outsider's perspective, it's naturally a heroic act." Mond's eyes lit up. "Oh? So you agree?" "Not entirely. If I were an insider, especially a victim of so-called despicable means, then I'm afraid I would be filled with hatred." Mond's face instantly darkened. "Eileen, you might encounter some unavoidable situations in the future, and you'll only be able to choose the least bad option from among the bad ones." That was the only way he could explain it, but it only made Eileen more and more confused. "Senior, what's wrong with you? Why are you suddenly talking about this?" Sigh, never mind." Mond didn't know how to explain Eileen's words, so he could only quietly cover it up. Chapter 281. Could it be that I'm not a protagonist? "Lord Grilesman, I'm about to return to Gabella, and I've come to bother you one last time before I leave." Sitting in the reception room was Mond Langdon, the scholar from the Scholar's Tower who had visited a few days ago. Paul had assumed he would leave the Northwest Bay after taking Kevin from the prison, but he hadn't expected him to come again. Bringing him to the Lord's Manor was Mond's Gabella fellow townsman, Betty. Mr. Langdon, is there anything else? Which prisoner do you wish to take away this time? Oh no. This time, I simply came to say goodbye. The scholar's answer puzzled Paul. They had only met once, and there wasn't much of a relationship between them. It was strange that he would come all the way to tell him before leaving. Even Eileen, sitting nearby, found it odd. After their reunion at the Dragon Pavilion, Mond had taken Kevin home, and a few days later, he had returned to Lakeshire, asking her to introduce him to Paul again. Had these two hit it off so well that they had become friends after just one conversation? Mond Langdon, with an admiring look, said to Paul, "These past few days, I've traveled extensively throughout your territory, and everything I've seen and heard indicates that you are an extraordinary lord." Traveled extensively? Wait, is he spying? Paul was startled, then quickly relaxed. Not only was Mond an acquaintance of Betty, but no spy would specifically come to him to walk right into a trap. Hell, this guy isn't just here to flatter me, is he? I saw ships with heavy sails in the harbor, bustling trade in the market, shops overflowing with exquisite utensils and ironware, schools for commoners in town, and farmers even told me about a mechanical monster that can quickly harvest grain. Oh, and public toilets and bathhouses. People say all these things are thanks to you. Haha, Mr. Langdon, you flatter me. Mond changed the subject abruptly. My lord, what are your chances of winning the war against the Duke of the Northwest? This guy's thinking is quite unpredictable. I can hardly keep up. Paul shook his head and said seriously, Mr. Langdon, first I must correct your statement. Maltz Kent is merely a usurper. His dukedom is illegitimate. We have a letter from the previous duke and his brother as proof. Mond apologized. My wording was inappropriate. Please forgive me. Paul then said, as for the war with Maltz Kent, I am 100% confident of victory. If it weren't for that riot, my army might already be at Sent City. Mond agreed. Just by the fact that your people don't look hungry, I think so too. I really don't know how you did it. Before Paul could answer, Eileen said from the side, it's simple. Just abolish those messy taxes, and then crack down on the egregious practice of price gouging. Wouldn't the people then have money to buy more grain? Over the past year, Paul had the government abolish a whole host of taxes that baffled this transmigrator: livestock tax, poultry tax, dog tax, brewing tax, dowry tax, and so on. What the hell were these geniuses who invented? Except for salt farmers like Kevin, whose circumstances were special, the disposable income of most citizens had increased significantly, further promoting commercial development and prosperity. Mond pondered, after defeating the Kent family, you, Earl, will surely become the dominant force in the Northwest Bay. He had carefully inquired about the Battle of Battalberg. And Paul's army had clearly played a decisive role. Paul quickly waved his hand. No, I wouldn't dare to aspire to dominate the situation in the Northwest Bay. Besides, there's His Majesty the King. How could I presume to overstep my bounds? He didn't notice that when His Majesty the King was mentioned, Eileen's lips curved into a beautiful smile. Earl Gleman. Mond's expression and tone suddenly turned serious, making Paul and Eileen tense. Whether you like it or not, you will inevitably wield considerable power at that time. This power may come from your authority, your army, or simply your prestige, but it will certainly be a force to be reckoned with. And this power cannot be abused, nor can it be left unused. There was a lecturing tone in Mond's words, which slightly annoyed Paul. However, he didn't show it, only looking at him with a questioning gaze. The scholar continued, remember our previous conversation? I believe, only a wise lord, or rather, a leader, is qualified and capable of wielding this power of yours. Oh, is he trying to persuade me to be a wise lord? Paul thought so. He picked up his water glass. Haha, Mr. Langdon, actually our views are not entirely opposed. Why must we separate heroes from the people? Don't you think that heroes are often part of the people? Of course, I will try my best to move in that direction. Mond interrupted him. Exactly, but what I want to ask is, when this great hero appears at some point in the future, will you assist him, or even go further, be loyal to him? PFFT, so he wasn't talking about me. Paul spat out the water he had just drunk. What do you mean? What do you mean by that? Before the scholar could answer, Eileen, standing beside him, reminded him with an unhappy expression, "Senior Mond, Earl Griles is a vassal of the Kingdom of Alder, and he already has someone he is loyal to, His Majesty Rodney's VI." Mond Langdon maintained a serious expression and said in a deep voice, "When the prophesied apocalypse arrives, kingdoms, empires, duchies, alliances, and so on will all lose their meaning. Old ties will only become burdens and obstacles. Before ultimate justice, the continuation of our culture, ethics, and morality, none of that matters." These words stunned Paul and Eileen. What prophesied apocalypse? What ultimate justice? Dude, this sounds so melodramatic. But judging from Mond Langdon's expression, he didn't seem to be joking at all. Even if it means sacrificing what we currently consider beautiful, family, kinship, friendship, he turned to Eileen, a hint of pity in his expression. "Betty, when everything you cherish is sacrificed for ultimate justice, will you stand against justice?" Eileen replied blankly, I don't know, Senior, I don't understand what you're talking about." Paul asked, his face full of questions. "Can you explain it more clearly?" Mond didn't explain, continuing, "You'll understand as the situation develops further. Betty, Earl Gleman, you are both good people, and I want to give you some advice. Don't resist the tide of history, but rather submit to it and integrate into it. Only by uniting as one under the leadership of the Savior can we overcome this difficulty. That's all I have to say. I'll take my leave." He bowed to Paul, glanced at Eileen, and turned to leave the reception room, leaving the two looking at each other in bewilderment. "Betty, is your senior a member of some cult?" I've never heard him say anything so strange. What has happened these past few years?" Paul looked in the direction Mond Langdon had left, his heart filled with mixed emotions. Savior? Loyalty? Could it be that I, the transmigrator, am not the protagonist? Chapter 282. Mond Langdon left with his new junior. Although Paul still didn't understand the meaning of his words before leaving, he had more important things to do. After the April 15th incident, in addition to the 2 battalions stationed in northern Emden, the remaining 2 infantry battalions, in conjunction with the Internal Security Forces and the Public Security Department, conducted a thorough search of Ardla and Berden, dismantling as many as 16 conspiracy groups, even one in the nearby town of Lakehart. This number startled Paul. Had so many ticking time bombs been planted under his nose? "What kind of intelligence chief are you? Replace him if you can't do it." At this moment, Cecil stood on the Lord's office, head down, silent, waiting for the Count's next reprimand. Although the office door was only closed, the Count's roar could almost echo throughout the entire castle. Paul was furious and scolded Cecil for half an hour in the room. Oh my God. At this rate, it wouldn't be surprising if this place were burned down one day. He finally seemed exhausted from talking, slumping into his chair like a deflated balloon. "Ahem, Lord, please allow me to explain." Cecil finally spoke. "My lord, our resources are truly limited. As you instructed, the intelligence department's focus is on protecting new technologies from being stolen. Due to the recent war, a significant portion of our energy has also been diverted to gathering intelligence on the Kent family's territory." Paul's eyes widened. "You mean the responsibility lies with me?" No, Cecil hurriedly denied, his eyes darting around. "I was merely stating the objective difficulties." The intelligence chief's tone was full of grievance. Paul rubbed his forehead, his head was throbbing. Cecil was indeed telling the truth, and logically, he couldn't be blamed. In his previous life as a programmer, Paul had experienced a feeling of being unable to cook without ingredients when facing a boss. "All right then, from now on, you'll focus solely on intelligence work. You can relinquish your forestry supervisor duties for now." "As you command, Lord Griles." Although Cecil was uncomfortable with the Earl relinquishing some of his power, he had no choice but to accept it. Moreover, he truly needed to devote all his energy to intelligence gathering. That kind of thing must never happen again, Cecil vowed silently. Paul stared blankly at the calendar on the wall, muttering, "It's already late May." Cecil knew that the Earl was currently thinking about joining forces with the other lords in the alliance. Due to the April 15th incident, Ardna's original military deployment was disrupted, making it impossible to fulfill the agreement with the lords to join forces in May. Fortunately, Earl Parker took the lead in expressing understanding, suggesting that Paul settle things at home first. Then they went off on their own. "I wonder how the battle is going now." The latest news was that they had led their troops eastward towards Battalberg. It seems the last battle gave them a lot of confidence. Cecil reminded Paul, "My lord, do you remember the news that came back last time? The Kent family seems to have sent people south to look for mercenaries. Paul, I remember now, mercenaries? Are they similar to adventurers? Cecil, yes, similar to the adventure groups you encountered before, but these people have absolutely no bottom line. As long as they get enough money, they won't follow any rules. They don't take ordinary jobs, they specialize in doing business in places with frequent chaos, living a life of constant danger. Each of them has accumulated rich combat experience and is a true professional killer. Paul, they seem quite difficult to deal with. But as long as they still carry weapons like swords, spears, and bows, we don't need to be afraid of them. Cecil, but our allies are a different story. One or two aren't much of a threat, but mercenaries nowadays operate in groups, forming large mercenary groups, and even giving rise to the profession of war contractors. Oh? An otherworldly version of Blackwater? Just then, a guard came to report, Your Excellency, Viscount Heller requests an audience. Paul was surprised. Derek Heller? Wasn't he leading his family's army eastward with the others? The guard replied, I don't know the specifics, but the Viscount seems very anxious and eager to see you. Take him to the reception room. I'll be right there. Derek paced anxiously in the reception room. He had come to Lake Town to seek reinforcements. The Allied forces had just suffered a major defeat. In early May, the lords had regrouped their armies and met at Bittoburg. The farm work was almost finished, and there was plenty of manpower available. So, according to their previous plan, they resumed their war against the usurper, Maltz Kent. There was unrest in the Gleman family's territory. He couldn't come? Excellent. This suited many people's wishes. In the last battle of Bittoburg, Paul's army had made a name for themselves, even seizing half of Emden after the battle. Maltz Kent's stronghold, one of the most fertile territories in the Northwest Bay. Many had long coveted it, determined to profit handsomely in the upcoming battles. With Gleman absent, a formidable rival for the spoils was eliminated. The Allied commanders were confident of victory. Their assessment wasn't unfounded. In the Northwest Bay, there was a saying, the Kent family never holds grudges. Given Maltz Kent's vengeful nature, he would immediately retaliate fiercely after suffering a loss. Last time, when the enemy initiated a truce, everyone assumed it was a delaying tactic, remaining on high alert even after returning home, ready to regroup at the slightest sign of trouble. But over a month had passed, and the enemy had made no move. The Kent family was truly finished. Everyone reached this conclusion unanimously. What were they waiting for? Let's strike while the enemy is down. The army regrouped and marched directly towards Sent City, the generals planning to end the war in one fell swoop. On their advance, they did encounter resistance several times, and although the fighting was tough, the Allied forces were victorious each time, further strengthening their confidence in victory. Finally, they approached the Ferdinand family's directly controlled territory. It was there that the Allied forces encountered a mercenary group hired by the Kent family. Chapter 283. On the 26th, scouts reported that the Kent family's army was moving towards us. However, according to the intelligence we've gathered, they number around 5,000, while our army has a numerical advantage of over 8,000. This overwhelming disparity in strength makes everyone believe that victory in the upcoming battle is inevitable. In the reception room of the Lord's Manor, Viscount Derek Heller was recounting the previous battle to Paul. Also listening were Chief of Staff Schroeder, Intelligence Director Cecil, and others. We formed ranks and slowly approached the enemy. Upon encountering them, we found their numbers to be significantly smaller than ours. However, unlike before, the Kent family's army had a large number of soldiers equipped with a special type of bow, the longbow. These were probably mercenaries Maltz had recruited from the south. After all, training longbowmen takes more than a month or two. It was late when we encountered them, so neither side had any intention of fighting, and we simply set up camp. That evening, we delivered a challenge to the enemy, agreeing to a decisive battle the following day. Although it rained heavily that night, the morale of the entire army was high, filled with confidence in victory. The next day, the 27th, the two armies finally faced their fate. The enemy had deployed most of their forces in a horizontal line formation, with a vanguard on the right flank and the rearguard on the left. Archers were positioned in the gaps between the battle lines, and the flanks were also mainly composed of archers. The entire force was arranged in a diagonal line, seemingly without any reserves. We have also devised a battle plan. Earl Malkin and Viscount Johnston will each lead a cavalry force to attack the enemy's archers on both flanks, while I will lead another cavalry force to outflank their rear camp and attack their supply wagons. Earl Parker and the other generals will lead infantry to attack the enemy's center. If the plan is successfully implemented, the enemy will undoubtedly collapse quickly under the simultaneous attack of our multiple forces." As he said this, Derek's face showed a mixture of resentment and unwillingness, and he took a large gulp of wine to perk himself up. However, the recent string of victories has clouded the judgment of many. Many officers from noble families, due to their similar ranks, have become fiercely competitive, disrupting the originally orderly plans. This has resulted in numerous troops being deployed in unsuitable positions, leading to a series of tragedies since the start of the war. Another reason is the damp ground. Last night's heavy rains have made the ground extremely muddy, severely hindering the performance of our cavalry. The combination of discipline and road conditions has prevented us from forming a disciplined formation, while the enemy has been patiently waiting for our attack. The Kent family's army numbered about 3,000 longbowmen. They raised their longbows and unleashed a volley of arrows. The arrows were so dense, like a rainstorm, so fierce, so swift. Their force was so great that they could even pierce some metal armor and penetrate flesh. The pitiful cries of soldiers wounded by arrows echoed throughout our ranks. Frightened and wounded war horses neighed and struggled wildly, out of control. We were in complete disarray, men and horses scattered. The volleys of arrows and the muddy ground severely hampered our charge. In fact, the longbowmen's casualties were mainly on the lightly armored squires, having little effect on the well-protected knights. However, because of the mud, many chose to dismount and walk. Wearing heavy armor, specifically designed for mounted charges, the mud underfoot greatly depleted their stamina and severely affected their agility. As a result, upon reaching the enemy lines, many were killed by the lightly dressed enemy with hammers and daggers. The first cavalry charge failed, but our main infantry, shields raised, continued to advance on the enemy. At a distance of about 50 yards, the enemy longbowmen stopped firing into the air and began firing straight at us. The wounded in front fell to the ground, while those behind were tripped and fell. It was in this constant struggle that our troops exhausted themselves. Faced with this situation, the reasonable countermeasure now seems to be to exchange fire with the same ranged means, but at that time our archers and crossbowmen were positioned behind the infantry and cavalry. Their range could not cover the enemy, and if they fired rashly from their rear positions, they would injure their own men in front, Derek Heller said with shame and regret. Thus, our attack failed, and Earl Parker had to order a retreat, while the enemy took the opportunity to pursue us. Our men were terrified by the enemy's longbowmen, and during the retreat, they were in disarray and could no longer organize an effective resistance. After that battle, only about 3,000 of the original 8,000 men remained. Once again, the advantage returned to the Kent family. We rallied the defeated troops, regrouped, and fought another battle, but we were defeated again. Their longbowmen were simply too formidable. They had instilled fear deep in the hearts of the soldiers. Derek Heller covered his face. And so, we retreated all the way to Beagleburg, the place where we had regrouped and set off. All the land behind us was lost to the Kent family, and a month's worth of gains vanished. Paul shook his head with sympathy after hearing Derek's account. "Oh, Derek, it's a pity things have turned out this way. What help do you seek from me?" Derek stared intently at Paul. "Yes, Earl Gleman, only you can turn our tide now. Bring your muskets and cannons back to the battlefield, only firearms can counter their longbowmen." Paul frowned. "Derek, as you know, things haven't been peaceful in my territory lately. Wasn't the uprising suppressed for a long time? There might still be rats lurking in the shadows. You've punished so many people, they won't dare start a second uprising so soon." Paul could only say, "Very well, Derek. But I need to discuss it carefully with my generals." Derek said gratefully, "Thank you, Earl Gleman, but please do it as soon as possible. Also, if possible, please sell us a batch of firearms, even your discarded ones. We'd be happy to pay a high price. I also need to discuss it with my men." At this moment, Paul had already made up his mind. He didn't want to be in a league that was about to fail. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 284. Paul first calmed Derek down, had him taken to rest, and then convened a meeting of the leaders. Hansel shook his head. "The situation is not optimistic. If we don't step in, our previous investments will be wasted. Paul asked, what is the situation in Arda and Baradin, sir? I believe the situation within the territory is currently stable and can support a large-scale military operation. Yes, after those 16 gangs were exposed, there shouldn't be any new conspiracy groups. Even if there are, they won't be very powerful. The internal security forces and police are sufficient to suppress them. Intelligence Director Cecil and Public Security Director Hayes confirmed this to Paul. Paul turned to Schroeder. Shall we send troops to Bittoburg now? No, Lord Gleman. Before Schroeder could answer, Hansel objected, drawing puzzled glances from everyone. I suggest we don't send troops directly to Bittoburg, but instead continue with a previously shelved plan and land troops on the upper reaches of the Ves River. He then explained his reasons. The tyrant's army is currently focused on Bittoburg, and the upper reaches of the Ves River, their rear, are an excellent point of attack. If their heartland is attacked, the enemy will definitely send troops back from the front lines to reinforce it, and the threat to Bittoburg will naturally disappear, or at least the pressure will be greatly reduced. The previous siege of Bittoburg by the Allied forces proves that it's not an easy place to take. Giving them some military aid should be enough to hold out until we land on the upper reaches of the Ves River. Schroeder nodded. That makes sense. Our navy won't encounter any effective resistance on the Ves River. It can be said to be unimpeded. Paul hesitated, but won't this cause dissatisfaction among our allies? It feels like we're abandoning them. Hansel shook his head. My lord, didn't I suggest you provide them with a batch of military equipment? Oh, right. Just transport the weapons and armor that haven't been loaded onto ships in Fland Harbor to Bittoburg. After the establishment of the Northwest Industry, with the abundant supply of iron ingots from Arda, blacksmith workshops in various territories work day and night to forge weapons and armor. These weapons were then collected and sent to Flanders Port, awaiting loading onto ships for transport to the south. To Paul's great bewilderment, the lords preferred to sell these high-quality weapons and armor to the south for money rather than equip them with their own soldiers. Otherwise, they wouldn't have suffered such a crushing defeat under the attack of the longbows. Is this appropriate? After all, it's something everyone uses to make money. In critical moments, is victory more important or money? Hansel stared into Paul's eyes and said, word by word, the key is, Lord Gleman, are you willing to share the newly occupied land with others? If we start from Bittoburg, there will be a lot of wrangling later. Paul's eyes immediately showed no hesitation. He turned to Schroeder and said, refine the previous plan and land on the upper reaches of the Weiss River. He then instructed Hansel, you will explain our reasons for doing this to Derek. I hope I won't give our allies a bad impression. Schroeder and Hansel answered in unison, yes, my lord. As for the upcoming landing operation, Paul stood up and said solemnly, it is obvious that this is a second front opened up against the usurper Maltz Kent. It has special and significant meaning. Therefore, this operation needs a name that matches its significance. I have decided to name it Operation Overlord. In the previous plan, the attack on the upper reaches of the Weiss River was more of a harassment. Now, it is a real attack and occupation. The Navy's warships will play a crucial role during this period, tasked with transporting troops and resupplying them. Due to manpower shortages, sailors may also need to fight ashore. Austin, Quick, Yarman, Tirpitz, and other senior naval officers were quickly summoned to Lakeshire to discuss the new offensive plan. They meticulously planned the operation in the General Staff, ultimately deciding that Chief of Staff Schroeder would personally command it. The old knight was very familiar with the geography of the Upper Weiss River. The forces participating in Operation Overlord included Crow's 2nd Infantry Battalion, Andrews' 4th Infantry Battalion, Yarman's 2nd Fleet, and Tirpitz's 3rd Fleet. Quick was strongly dissatisfied, feeling that his 1st Fleet should participate in the operation, both in terms of unit designation and combat experience. However, he was turned away by the need for naval personnel to remain in the outer seas outside Austin's fleet. Nevertheless, the 1st Fleet's cadets were allowed to participate in the operation to hone their military skills. With both infantry battalions deployed, Arda and Baradin would have to rely solely on their internal guard and police for defense. Fortunately, Bryce's 1st Infantry Battalion and Joyce's 3rd Infantry Battalion were stationed in northern Emden, providing some protection against unforeseen circumstances. Furthermore, there was a large militia force. The militia under the new reserve system was far more reliable than the so-called militia of other territories. Derek, who had come seeking reinforcements, was somewhat disheartened upon learning that Lacquer town wasn't planning to directly aid Bittoburg, but instead attack the Kent family's rear. Paul felt a pang of guilt and immediately gave Hansel a wink. Hansel promptly instilled in Derek a well-prepared lecture on the big picture. Our Earl said that to untangle a knotted rope, you can't use brute force. To resolve a conflict, you can't personally participate in the fighting. To overcome a crisis, you must seize the key point and take advantage of the situation. Only then can the constraints on the Allied forces naturally dissipate. Now the Kent family's elite troops have come out in full force. If we attack their rear, their frontline troops will surely return to reinforce them, thus eliminating the threat to Bittoburg. By the Lord of Light's blessing, the Vis River flows directly to the enemy's rear, and they have no decent naval forces. This is a godsend. Viscount Heller, trust in the speed of our warships. Look, that boat on the lake is our new warship. See those sails? They're much faster than hand-rowed sailboats. Amid Hansel's eloquent explanation, Derek finally opened up, and what delighted him even more was that Lake Town planned to provide them with a batch of firearms. These weapons included dozens of crates of improved hand grenades, as well as so-called mother and child cannons, supposedly a type of rapid-loading artillery, well-suited for defending against large swarms of enemy troops. Paul said, "Please tell the lords that we have no other request than that the Allied forces hold out for 3 weeks, no, half a month, after which everything will improve." Chapter 285. Back in April, the Arda Navy began reconnaissance of the upper reaches of the Vis River, both by land and water. However, the reconnaissance on the water was conducted in galleys, disguised as ordinary merchants. They needed to ascertain the water level, siltation, and other information, otherwise, what if a larger warship carrying nearly 20 cannons and hundreds of sailors ran aground? They also thoroughly investigated the ports along the river. Based on this readily available information, the General Staff, after careful consideration, finally chose a place called Fishtail Town. The Lord of Fishtail Town was named Solo Carter, a viscount, formerly a vassal of the Ferdinand family, but now loyal to Maltz Kent, now openly known as Maltz Ferdinand. This viscount was aware that he might become a target of the Arda Navy. After all, Arda had recently dealt with pirates and clearly possessed considerable naval power, making an upstream attack along the Vis River a logical course of action. Therefore, after the two major factions in the Northwest Bay went to war, he fortified the defenses of Fishtail, repaired the city walls, trained militia, and even somehow acquired 4 crossbows. However, the General Staff still chose this location because its dock facilities were the most complete, sufficient to unload various supplies. The Arda Army's logistical requirements exceeded those of other armies of the time. Entering June, increased rainfall made the Weiss River even fuller, and the monsoon winds from the sea provided ample power for the sailing warships. After more than a week of intensive preparations, the 2nd and 3rd Fleets, a total of 16 ships carrying 2 infantry battalions, set sail. The Navy, in addition to 4 sailing warships, also had 12 galleys, some of which were their own, and some were conscripted from the civilian population. Including the sailors, the first wave of troops for this expedition totaled more than 1,600 men. Just as Operation Overlord was about to begin, Arda's aid supplies arrived at Fort Beto with Derek. How could he do this? Gleman is absolutely outrageous. Earl Malkin was furious, but what angered him wasn't that Gleman hadn't sent troops directly. How could he transport the goods here without everyone's consent? That's a huge financial loss. What truly angered him was that Paul had arbitrarily given them the weapons and armor awaiting export from Northwest Industries. Hearing Earl Malkin's words, everyone in the hall nearly collapsed in laughter. Earl Price Parker, ahem, the situation is urgent, and Earl Gleman's actions are understandable. With this batch of weapons, it will be much easier for us to hold Bittoburg. He turned to Derek. So, we only need to hold out for 2 weeks, right? Derek confirmed. That's what Earl Gleman said, unless the Arda Army's operation up the Vis River fails. Some began to pray silently. Earl Parker rallied the troops. Cheer up, gentlemen. After all, we now have 4 cannons. The mention of cannons made everyone's eyes light up. Gleman had actually gifted them such powerful weapons. The impressive performance of cannons in the Battle of Bittoburg was still enticing. A total of 4 cannons had been brought. The Heller, Parker, Malkin, and Johnston families, having contributed the most troops, each received 1 cannon, leaving the other minor lords only able to watch with envy. Boom, on the walls of Bittoburg. The artillery instructors who had accompanied them were teaching the Allied soldiers how to operate the cannons. The cannons provided to the Allied forces were a new type of artillery, even for the army, the breech-loading cannon, also known as the flange in another timeline. It was introduced from Portugal during the Ming Dynasty and mass-produced. It was an iron breech-loading smoothbore cannon, consisting of 3 parts, the barrel, the breech, and the cannon section. Gunpowder and projectiles were pre-packaged in the sub-cannons. To fire, the sub-cannon was simply placed inside the main cannon. After firing one sub-cannon, another was placed inside to fire. Because the propellant and projectiles were pre-sealed within the sub-cannons, the rate of fire was significantly increased compared to previous muzzle-loading cannons. Therefore, Paul gave it another name, the rapid-fire cannon. However, limited by their technological capabilities, the cannon-casting craftsmen of Arda couldn't solve the problem of large tolerances between the sub-cannons and the main cannon, leading to significant gunpowder gas leakage. This resulted in a shorter range for the rapid-fire cannons, only about 300 meters, and due to their relatively complex mechanism, they could only be built relatively small. The 4 rapid-fire cannons had a total of 20 sub-cannons, enough to maintain uninterrupted firepower for a considerable period. Allied soldiers crowded the city walls, watching the chosen lucky ones operate the legendary Thunderhammer. With each deafening roar, gasps and exclamations of admiration echoed from the walls. The sheer power of the cannons at fire was truly terrifying. It was impossible to teach these novices how to estimate distances and calculate artillery elevation angles in a short time. Even the Arda army relied heavily on the gunners' experience and intuition. So, the Arda instructors first had the artillerymen fire from different angles, then measured the distance between the impact points and the castle, marking the impact points with conspicuous circles in white lime as reference points for quick aiming once the battle began. On the morning of June 3rd, the Kent army appeared on the plains outside Beethoven Castle. The castle walls crackled with a sound of sirens, and the defenders rushed to the top, tensely preparing for battle. It feels like they have over 8,000 of them this time. Good heavens, it looks like that guy Maltz is going to have us cornered, the lords whispered among themselves, their brows furrowed. The castle's defenders numbered only 2,000, far fewer than the enemy. Oh. What are those big guys? Jace looked triumphantly at the fortress ahead, a sense of impending revenge rising within him. The battle at Bitdoberg left him with an unforgettable humiliation, so much so that even a series of victories before that couldn't ease his resentment. Today, I can finally wash away that humiliation completely. Right where it all began, he clenched his fists tightly. A cloaked figure beside him whispered, "Viscount, since this is a siege, my men will only provide support." Jace smiled and nodded, "All right, Captain Doug. But once we advance to the walls, we'll need your longbows to suppress the enemy." The cloaked figure nodded. Jace waved his hand. "Prepare our Thunderhammers." 6 colossal machines, propelled by soldiers, slowly advanced towards Bitdoberg. They were 6 enormous catapults. Chapter 286. Boom, a millstone-sized boulder rained down from the sky. Fortunately, it didn't hit anyone, but the enormous sound of it striking the wall still sent chills down everyone's spine. If such a large boulder had hit someone, wouldn't they have been instantly turned into a bloody pulp? The defenders of Bitau Castle were terrified, cowering behind the parapet, too afraid to show their faces. Outside the wall, Jace was very satisfied with the test launch of the catapult and laughed heartily. He turned his head slightly and praised, "Captain Doug, the technology you brought is truly useful. I've been struggling to counter the rebels' Thunderhammers, and now that we've created such a weapon, it's no less formidable than theirs." The cloaked mercenary captain beside him smiled slightly. "You flatter me, sir. But I'd like to see just what kind of divine weapon this Thunderhammer you speak of is. I'm looking forward to seeing them fire a few shots." Jace flicked his whip, pointing towards Bitdoberg. "Look. That dark thing on the wall is it? But, HMPH, it seems that without Gleman, these remaining fools can't handle it. What a waste of such a good weapon." Before the attack, he had sent scouts to thoroughly reconnoiter Bitdoberg. No Gleman or Garnered family flags were flying on the walls, but the flags of all the other families in the Allied forces were present. It seemed these 2 lads were indeed preoccupied with matters in their territory. Their father's strategy had indeed worked. Mercenary Captain Doug followed Jace's pointing finger, but even with his excellent eyesight, he could only make out a vague outline at this distance. He pleaded, "Viscount, after the battle, this Thunderhammer, Jace smiled. Don't worry, as long as you fight well, you'll naturally get half of it. Thank you, sir. We mercenaries love collecting and studying novel weapons. The more we know, the more secure we are. HMPH, after we take this castle, let alone the Thunder Hammer, I'll give you even more. While Jace and the mercenary captain were engaged in lively discussion, the lords of the allied forces were venting their anger in one of the strongest towers. Useless. Fools. We've been suppressed so quickly, don't you know anything now that the instructors are gone? When the instructors sent by Paul were teaching artillery, they only briefly mentioned that the gunpowder shouldn't get damp, which was common knowledge in the Alda army, so they hadn't paid much attention to it. Unexpectedly, the artillerymen selected by the allied forces were completely absorbed in the immense power of the cannons, and the instructor's warning, "Don't let the gunpowder get damp," went in one ear and out the other. Before the Kent army arrived, the artillery instructors, along with the supply company responsible for moving supplies, withdrew to Arda. Paul didn't want his precious artillerymen in such a dangerous place where their own army couldn't provide support. The Allied's newly minted rookie artillerymen took matters into their own hands and took all the gunpowder for firing from the warehouse, piling it up at the base of the city walls. The enemy could attack at any moment, and placing it nearby made it easy to access. Unfortunately, shortly before the Kent army arrived, a light rain fell over Biro Castle. While the Kent army was setting up the catapults, the Allied lords confidently ordered their artillery to strike first, blasting the catapults to smithereens before they were fully prepared. Then, the 4 cannons, which should have performed exceptionally well, fell silent before everyone's eyes. Then everyone remembered that gunpowder must not get wet. Without the aid of cannons, the Allied forces could only watch helplessly as the Kent army's catapults prepared, hurling millstone-sized stones at them time and again. What are you doing? Viscount Johnston drew his sword and brandished it wildly in the air. He looked furious, ready to kill. Several artillery officers trembled and knelt on the ground. But the Viscount restrained himself. These officers who knew how to operate cannons were invaluable, and were trusted members of their respective families. Earl Parker roared angrily, his face grim, "Hurry up and take the gunpowder out to dry while the sun is out." Earl Malkin also brandished his fist menacingly, "If anything goes wrong again, you'll lose your heads." The artillery officers immediately fled, heads in their hands. The lords exchanged silent glances. Derek said casually, "We can only hold out for a while. Luckily, we still have a dozen or so crates of grenades." Just as the battle for Bittelberg reignited, the Arda army's Operation Overlord also began. On the river north of Fishtail Town, 4 sailing warships lined up, their dark cannons menacingly watching the town. Although called a town, it was actually quite large, resembling a small city. The northern city wall was built along the river, with a water gate connecting the outer river to the artificial waterways within the city. Schroeder stood on the flagship's deck, calmly peering into the town through his binoculars. Beside him were Yarman and Tirpitz. The 2 fleet commanders seemed somewhat anxious. Tirpitz kept muttering, "Why aren't they back yet?" while Yarman frequently checked his pocket watch. Just as they were growing impatient, the water gate on the city wall opened, and a small ship emerged, heading straight for the flagship. After the small boat landed close to the shore, an officer climbed onto the deck and approached Scrutter. "Unfortunately, Viscount Solo Carter has not accepted our surrender offer." "This is his reply." Scrutter took the envelope, opened it, carefully read the reply, and then handed it to Tirpitz and Yarman. Tirpitz was furious after reading it. Although the letter was worded rather mildly, it contained a scathing critique of Paul Gleman for joining the unjust side and betraying the new Duke. "Lord Scrutter, begin the attack. Claude and Baron Andrew have already landed at the West Gate and are awaiting your command." Scrutter checked his pocket watch and nodded. "Begin the operation." At his command, chaos erupted on the 4 warships. Less than a minute later, deafening roars echoed from the south-facing sides of each warship. In an instant, Fishtail Town was bombarded by dozens of cannonballs. Some cannonballs struck the city walls, sending bricks and stones flying, injuring the soldiers atop them. Others flew over the walls, hitting houses in the town. The red-hot shells ignited upon contact with flammable materials. "It's Thunderhammer. It's the legendary Thunderhammer. Quick! Use the ballistae to retaliate." The defenders on the walls either cowered behind the crenellations in terror or scattered like headless flies. The soldiers operating the ballistae bravely stayed by their weapons, straining the torque winches to fire further. The commanding officer roared, "Fire!" The torque springs propelled the ballista arms, pulling the bowstring and launching 4 thick bolts towards the Arda fleet. Chapter 287 The Capture of Fishtail Town. The Alder army's cannonballs pounded the walls of Fishtail Town like hammer blows. The hastily repaired walls, clearly flimsy, teetered on the brink of collapse after nearly 2 hours of bombardment from the Navy's 12-pound cannons. The defenders initially took cover in the towers, but these towers, designed to withstand ordinary arrows and crossbow bolts, proved ineffective against the cannon fire, crumbling after just a few hits. A few men remained on the walls, while most fled in fear to the base. The Fishtail Town defenders' crossbow counterattack initially threw the Alder Navy into disarray. To ensure accurate targeting and minimize the loss of shell energy, the Navy's warships positioned themselves within 200 meters of the walls. At this distance, the defenders' ordinary bows and arrows were ineffective, but the crossbows had a range. They had long relied on long-range firepower to overwhelm the enemy and had never encountered anything like this before. However, they quickly discovered that the ballistae were not a threat, firstly because of their poor accuracy, due to both equipment and personnel skill, and secondly because of their limited numbers, only 4. Thus, the naval warships confidently unleashed their firepower upon Fishtail Town. Most of the garrison had been redeployed to the north of the town to prepare for an impending landing by the Alda army. With such overwhelming firepower, Viscount Carter believed the enemy would break through from the north. At the west gate of Fishtail Town, only a small squad of soldiers remained on guard, terrified by the artillery fire coming from the river to the north. But something even more alarming happened. An army suddenly emerged from the forest directly to their west. "The enemy is attacking the west gate. We need reinforcements. Go and inform the Viscount." The officer, his eyes wide and his voice trembling, shouted the order to his men. Although fierce fighting raged on the river to the north, it was merely a feint by the Arda army. Scrutter's strategy was a frontal feint followed by a flanking maneuver. 2 infantry battalions, already landed to the west, stealthily approached the west gate of Fishtail under the cover of the forest. After 2 hours of naval bombardment, they launched their attack. Upon receiving the report, Solo Carter hesitated, unsure of the enemy's main attack direction. While the Viscount hesitated, the 2nd and 3rd Infantry Battalion suppressed the defenders at the west gate with volleys of gunfire. There were too few defenders on the walls, and even fewer equipped with bows and arrows. Then the artillery pushed their cannons directly to within 20 meters of the gate, where the absence of a moat made their movement extremely easy. A few shots blasted through the gate of Fishtail, and the Arda soldiers poured in. The anticipated street fighting did not occur. While the defenders could hold out for a while with the thick walls providing protection, their morale collapsed instantly once the attackers entered the city. 5 rockets shot into the sky in quick succession and exploded. This was the army's signal to the Navy. The west gate had fallen. Schroeder, holding a telescope, saw the army's signal. His usual stern expression softened with a rare smile, and he immediately ordered the Navy to cease fire. He didn't order the sailors to detour through the west gate to support the army. Intelligence indicated the town lacked the strength to withstand 2 infantry battalions. After waiting for about an hour, figures appeared on the riverside walls, and the Gleman family flag was raised. The water gate quickly opened. As planned, Yarman stayed behind to command the fleet, while Schroeder and Tirpitz led 100 sailors in small boats through the water gate into Fishtail Town. He landed at the dock in the town's waterways. The streets were deserted, the residents had all evacuated the area. No one dared to stay home under the attack of Thunderhammer. There were, however, many collapsed houses, the result of naval shelling. Many shells had breached the walls and hit civilian homes within the town. Schroeder and Tirpitz met with the 2 army battalion commanders. "Congratulations, the operation went very smoothly." "What were the army casualties?" The commander of the 4th Infantry Battalion, Baron Andrew from Berdine, proudly replied, "No one was killed or wounded." After breaching the west gate, the defenders on the wall surrendered immediately. "We encountered enemy reinforcements while advancing towards the northern area, and they scattered after a volley of gunfire." This was the first time his troops had participated in an operation with the Arda army, and the success made him extremely excited. Schroeder nodded in satisfaction and then asked, "Other directions? We've sent men there, but we might not be able to intercept Solo Carter. After all, we're not besieging him. It would be best if we could intercept him, but even if he escapes, it doesn't matter." To everyone's surprise, Viscount Solo Carter did not flee. When the Arda army found him, the Viscount was leading a large group of people in prayer in the church in the center of town. The churchgoers were terrified when the soldiers stormed in, but the sounds of bayonets and gunfire quickly silenced them. The leading officer succinctly explained the discipline of the Arda army, promising not to harm their safety or plunder their property, provided they behaved themselves. Schroeder led the officers to the church and found Viscount Solo Carter, who was kneeling before the icon, eyes closed, quietly reciting a prayer, oblivious to their arrival. Schroeder, Viscount, you have failed. Solo Carter remained motionless, except for his mouth reciting the prayer. The priest in the church stood awkwardly to one side, glancing between his lord and Schroeder, sweating profusely with anxiety. Andrew shouted, Solo Carter, face reality. Stop your family and your lands from resisting. Hearing a slightly familiar voice, Viscount Carter opened his eyes, stood up, and stared at Andrew. As fellow nobles of the Northwest Bay, they knew each other. Deep Andrew, I didn't expect to see you here. Well, Berdine joined the alliance against the Duke. Andrew advised him, for the sake of your family, surrender. Following a usurper will only lead to a bad end. Solo Carter straightened his clothes. Fine, since you're here, I'll surrender. However, in my personal capacity, my family will not surrender. Besides, I only surrender to you, a fellow noble. You, Claude and Tirpitz, standing to the side, were furious. At a time like this, why the pretense? Schroeder stopped the two from erupting, saying calmly, that's settled then. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew, you will accept the Viscount's surrender. Although Fishtail Town had fallen, the Carter family's territory extended beyond this. There was still more to fight for. Sorry, I've been engrossed in a novel lately, neglecting updates. I apologize for all the recommendations and monthly tickets. Chapter 288. News of the Arda armies landing on the upper reaches of the Vis River quickly reached Sent, causing a great stir in the largest city in the Northwest Bay. The Duke's palace immediately issued a statement to suppress the news, claiming it was merely a rumor spread by a rebel alliance led by Earl Parker to sow discord among the troops and the people, and ordered that no one discuss the matter. However, the people remained uneasy, and the news continued to circulate privately. As the city where the Duke of the Northwest resided, Sent had not experienced the ravages of war for a long time. In this era, war meant looting, slaughter, and the humiliation of women. Many wealthy families were already planning to flee in secret. In the main hall of the Duke's palace, the atmosphere was heavy, and everyone waited in silence for their lord's arrival. In the days that Jace had won a series of victories, the hall had been filled with laughter and joy, but now not a single word could be heard. In a small room at the back of the hall, Maltz Kent was discussing matters with his intelligence chief and Emerson. It's that guy Gleman again. Maltz Kent gritted his teeth in hatred. He glared at the intelligence chief with obvious displeasure. What's going on? We went to so much trouble to hold him off for such a short time? The intelligence chief, sweating profusely from the glare, immediately defended himself. Your Grace, intelligence work in Arda and Bardin is fraught with difficulties. The conscription stations, militia, farmers' associations. Gleman's influence on the local areas, both military and political, is growing stronger. Recently, he even established a public security system to maintain order within the territory. Furthermore, his administration has abolished a large number of exorbitant taxes, and the people's loyalty to Gleman as their lord is increasing daily. Those landowners in the countryside are all spineless, without any real loss of interests. They all cower at the prospect of directly opposing their lord. After the Salt Peasant uprising, Lakeside Town is on high alert for any similar incidents, making it extremely difficult to create a second one. Maltz, quite displeased, coldly said, I don't want to hear any excuses. I gave you money and resources, you must give me corresponding results. Otherwise, it won't be as simple as just replacing someone. The intelligence chief shuddered, replying with fear. Yes, Your Grace. Maltz sighed. Alice, they're all useless. Emerson, standing beside him, asked, Uncle, don't worry too much. Once all the lords arrive, they'll surely come up with a proper way to deal with the current situation. HMPH, Maltz said discontentedly, what kind of bullshit can they come up with? Do you think I don't know what they were thinking? When things are going well, they rush in, afraid of missing out on the benefits. When things are going badly, they all hesitate, afraid that their own men will die. These people can be used, but not conspired with. Emerson, I plan to temporarily halt the offensive on Bitauberg and have Jace return to deal with the Fishtail Town matter first. What do you think? Emerson thought for a moment and said, I don't think it's appropriate. The siege of Bitauberg is currently intense, and a large number of troops and resources have already been invested. If we abandon it, all our previous efforts will be wasted. Moreover, returning now will cause unrest in the army. Not only will we be exhausted from running between two places, but wouldn't that clearly indicate that something is wrong with our rear? You're right. Is there any other solution? Why not send the mercenaries who stayed and sent to train our longbowmen to Fishtail Town, along with our newly trained longbowmen, to test the results of their training? We don't need to recapture Fishtail Town immediately, just block them. After we capture Bitauberg, we can concentrate our forces to annihilate or drive back the Arda army. Maltzkent stroked his beard, pondering Emerson's plan. All right, let's do it that way. At this moment, a servant entered, cautiously saying, Your Grace, all the lords from various regions have arrived and are waiting for your arrival. Maltz stood up and waved his hand. Come, follow me. It's time to squeeze some more value out of them. The lords gathered in the hall had finally received their duke. They were extremely anxious. Although the events in Fishtail Town were being treated as rumors among the common people, for these powerful figures, it was a real threat. The Duke had finally arrived. The siege of Bitauberg cannot be lifted, so we need to organize another army to drive the Ardis back. The Duke's words made everyone groan inwardly, but there seemed to be no better solution at the moment. Earlets must send no fewer than 800 men, Viscounts no fewer than 400, and Barons no fewer than 200. Maltz set the standards for each household's contribution, his tone firm and leaving no room for compromise. In addition, they must provide their own rations and weapons. After a week, a massive army was assembled and sent. The total number of soldiers sent by the lords from various regions reached 5,000, plus the 1,000 men Maltzkent himself recruited, as well as mercenary troops, bringing the army's size to over 6,000. Fergus looked at the massive army training in the drill ground and sneered. Your duke is far too cautious. I heard that only a mere 1,000-odd aldermen landed in Fishtail Town. Is it really necessary to make such a big fuss? He was the leader of another mercenary group that Emerson had hired, but because he arrived late, he missed Jace's departure. Because Jace had won consecutive battles, his group was not transferred to the front lines but remained in Sent City as instructors to train longbowmen for the Duke's mansion. The Duke wanted to have a longbowman force completely under his control. This greatly displeased Fergus. Emerson had privately promised them that their pay would not be reduced, which was why they were allowed to stay. An officer sent by the Duke's mansion to coordinate the mercenary group smiled wryly. The mercenary captain's sarcasm was all too obvious. Captain Fergus, be careful. The Arda's fire crossbows are not easy to deal with. Their range is comparable to longbows, but their power is even greater. If there's any weakness, it's only their slow rate of fire, and those terrifying thunder hammers, their practically divinely bestowed power. Their roar shakes the land, and they're indestructible. This officer had experienced the Battle of Bitauberg, and the performance of the 1st and 3rd Infantry Battalions had left a deep impression on him. And their fire crossbows can be used in close combat. Their soldiers are highly skilled in melee combat. Right, before the officer could finish, Fergus finished the sentence for him, leaving the man speechless. HMPH. I'll show the Arda who the true kings of land warfare are, the mercenary leader said disdainfully. And I'll let the Doug guy know who the #1 mercenary team is. Chapter 289 Surveying and Mapping. Joss lay on the grass, a blade of grass dangling from his mouth, swaying back and forth. Several other soldiers like him basked lazily in the sun. The sunlight was a bit dazzling, and Joss squinted, watching the figures bustling about in the distance. Hey, Tom, what are they thinking? It's just a map, why go to all this trouble, Joss? Before Joss could finish, a loud shout came from afar. Hearing this voice, the men sprang to their feet as if wound up tight, then stood at attention. Quit slacking off again, you bunch of bastards, their Sergeant Makarov, roared angrily from behind like a cannonball. Joss and the others remained standing, staring straight ahead without uttering a sound, inwardly cursing, damn it, caught red-handed by the sergeant. The sergeant turned to them and loudly reprimanded, don't you all know this? This isn't Arda or Barden, but Emden, the former territory of the Kent family. Who knows, a few lunatics loyal to the usurper might suddenly appear. What if something really happens? Makarov gave them a severe dressing down. In a place like this, vigilance is paramount. If even a hair on the Lord's precious student's head is missing, you'll bring your heads to me, and I'll bring mine to Lord Bryce. Do you all understand? Yes, Joss and his comrades responded loudly in unison. Tonight, each of you will write a self-criticism and hand it to me. Yes, the responses were tinged with sorrow. The precious students Makarov referred to were the figures busy in the distance. They were all from West Academy. A week ago, their platoon leader was transferred to the general staff, and the new platoon leader had also previously worked there. An officer rotation system, one of Scrutter's measures, required each general staff officer to regularly work with frontline troops to gain practical combat and operational experience, preventing them from becoming mere armchair strategists. Accompanying the new platoon leader was a group of students, and these students were quite remarkable. According to the platoon leader, they were Count Gleman's darlings. Battalion commanders Bryce and Joyce had even personally dined with them. Their purpose was to conduct some kind of surveying, simply put, to measure and draw, to create precise maps. Bryce assigned Makarov's company the task of assisting these students in completing their surveying work. The students split into several groups and worked independently, while Makarov and his comrades followed them, running around, helping to carry tools and acting as guards. After being caught red-handed by Makarov, Joss and the others dared not relax their vigilance any longer, remaining on high alert and keeping watch over their surroundings until dusk. It was getting late, so Makarov led Joss and the others towards the students. Orders from above didn't allow the Lord's precious students to tire out. It was time to take them back to the barracks. Upon approaching, they didn't interrupt the students' work but instead began to observe. Two students, one taller than the other, stood on the slope, each holding one end of a long bamboo pole, actually a bamboo ruler. Another student held a wooden board, an inclinometer, keeping the bottom edge of the board parallel to the measuring bamboo ruler. The board was engraved with a series of evenly spaced grooves forming a semicircle, with a center on the side of the board facing the sky. A straight line perpendicular to both sides of the board was engraved from the center. A small nail was driven into the center of the board, from which a small iron ball was suspended by a thin rope. The iron ball, pulled by a thin string, hung straight down to the ground. The string met the straight lines perpendicular to both sides of the wooden board at the center, forming an angle. Makarov asked in confusion, "What are you doing?" "Is this surveying?" A student, engrossed in writing something in his notebook, noticed Makarov's approach when he heard him. He looked at Makarov and the others, smiling shyly. "Sergeant, we're measuring the horizontal distance between 2 points," Joss asked. "Horizontal distance?" "Yes, look, this is a slope. We use this bamboo ruler to measure the slope distance directly. Then we use this inclinometer to get the angle of inclination, the angle between the bamboo ruler and the horizontal ground. Those short lines forming a semicircle are the scale marking the angle. We can calculate the horizontal distance using the slope distance and the angle of inclination." "Amazing. Is that all?" "Yes. That's mathematics." The students suddenly became excited. "The Lord is right. Mathematics is the key to understanding everything in the world. Did the Lord teach you this?" "Yes, the Lord personally taught us trigonometric functions." "Earl Gleman knows so much." At this point, the students all looked on with admiration. However, Makarov and the others didn't know anything about trigonometric functions. Why are we measuring this so-called horizontal distance?" "This is the orthographic projection method that the Lord taught us." For example, the student with the notebook gestured excitedly, explaining the principles of map-making to the soldiers. If you place something directly under a light source, the shadow it casts on the ground is its orthographic projection. The map we're drawing uses this method to project mountains, rivers, houses, roads, fields, and trees onto a horizontal plane. This horizontal plane is represented by a sheet of paper, so this type of map is also called a planar topographic map. Joss scratched his head. "I didn't see you guys flying up to see the projection." The student laughed. "Of course we can't fly up to see it. We have to use those control points to measure and draw it bit by bit." He pointed around, and the soldiers understood what the so-called control points were: long poles erected on the ground with conspicuous flags attached to them. When drawing a planar map, we first draw control points on the paper, and then, based on these control points, we measure and draw the areas between each point in detail. After listening to the students for a long time, Makarov, Joss, and the others were still confused, unable to understand many of the terms. They had seen the maps the other side had already drawn, and they were completely unfamiliar with them. These maps were very different from the ones they had seen with officers before. Those maps were like paintings, with vivid depictions of mountains, rivers, and buildings, easy to understand at a glance, but their accuracy was questionable. They only provided a general understanding of the geographical information. The students' maps, well, the whole thing felt serious, rigid, and terrible. All the vivid illustrations were gone, replaced by symbols, squares, straight lines, and irregular curves, apparently called contour lines, with unclear meanings. However, according to the students, their maps were far more accurate than the old maps. Before sunset, the soldiers escorted the students back to the barracks, carrying a large pile of surveying tools, right-angle levels, flume levels, right-angle tools, planes, tripods, and other strange instruments. After dinner, they received new orders from battalion headquarters: suspend surveying work. The 1st and 2nd battalions would begin their attack on Byronburg the next day, a feint, though. The point was to put enough pressure on the Kent family to draw the attention of enemy forces near Byronburg. The Allied forces defending Byronburg were on the verge of collapse. Chapter 290 Artillery Range Finding. What? Suspend the surveying work and send us back to Lakeside Town? The students were stunned. The news came too suddenly. Joss helplessly shrugged at them. This is an order from above. We just received it ourselves, he inwardly complained. Why did he have to be the one to deliver this thankless message? Tomorrow or the day after, we'll be heading south to engage the enemy. Only the necessary defensive forces will remain here, and we may not be able to guarantee your safety. The lead student was the first to react, whispering, Mr. Joss, perhaps we could. Before he could finish, Joss shook his head vigorously. I'm just a private, I can't decide anything. If you have any thoughts, you can go to Lords Bryce or Joyce. Only they can decide your fate. The lead student nodded. Thank you for reminding us. We'll discuss it. Joss said goodnight and left the room, leaving the students whispering amongst themselves. We can't just leave like this. The surveying work is only a small part complete. If we slink back like this, our group's results will definitely be at the bottom. What bad luck, drawing this place by lot. Let's have a good talk with Lord Blass and Lord Joyce tomorrow. Early the next morning, Blass and Joyce were discussing their southward journey. They had originally planned to depart today, but later realized they needed to make many unplanned preparations. A guard on duty outside came to report that students from the Weiss Academy requested to see them. Blass thought for a moment. Those students? Let them in. The Earl valued these students. What? No, the students came in and made a request that shocked Blass. They actually wanted to stay and finish their surveying work. Lakeside Town has repeatedly asked us to guarantee your safety. I can't let you wander around without guards. The student in the lead, their group leader, named Nick, looked anxious and pleaded again. Lord Bryce, thank you for your concern for our safety, but mapping is a very important task. We can't abandon it halfway. Alda is developing its mining industry, and exploration cannot be done without maps. Maps also facilitate merchants' travels and promote commerce. They are also of great significance to your army. With accurate maps, troop deployment and battle plans will be much easier. The Lord's Mansion attaches great importance to this matter, otherwise, they wouldn't have sent us students who haven't even finished our studies. Bryce just shook his head. Even if you have 1,000 reasons, I can't let you run around. The two sides were deadlocked for a while, but neither could convince the other. One student suddenly suggested, since we can't be left alone in the rear, why don't we go south with you? The geography there will need to be surveyed sooner or later anyway, hey? That's a great idea. Please let us go with you. Nick agreed with his classmate's suggestion, and the other students nodded in agreement. Still kidding. We're going to war. Do you think we're going sightseeing? Bryce frowned and continued to object. Although he had complete confidence in his troops, and it was a feint attack, the battlefield was unpredictable, and he couldn't guarantee that one or two people wouldn't make a mistake. Seeing that he couldn't persuade Bryce, Nick slapped his forehead, having come up with a good idea. Lord Bryce, what do you think? If you take us, we'll teach your artillerymen a simple range-finding method. Standing at their gun positions, they can relatively accurately measure the distance to the target without moving. Oh, Bryce and Joyce both perked up their ears. Nick's suggestion hit a nerve. The artillery units of the Arda army relied entirely on visual estimation to determine the distance to targets, which required a high level of experience from the gunners. Some experienced gunners with exceptional artillery talent could estimate the distance with a glance, fire a test shot, and then adjust the elevation or propellant charge to fire a second shot with precision. However, such talents were extremely rare. Most gunners, especially the newly recruited rookies, had to move the impact point closer to the target with each shot. If there were a method that allowed for relatively accurate range finding from the gun position, it would greatly enhance the role of the artillery. Nick smiled smugly, which piqued the interest of the two officers. Bryce asked, "Tell me what method you're talking about." Nick shook his head. "Then you'll have to promise us that you can travel south with the troops." Bryce was a little annoyed. This brat, barely out of school, dared to negotiate with me. A skill as crucial as artillery range finding, I could just deduct it from your lord's pay. However, thinking it would be ridiculous for a lieutenant colonel to argue with a bunch of teenagers, he suppressed his displeasure. He looked at Joyce, the battalion commander of the 3rd Battalion, who wasn't much older than the students, and his eyes were full of approval. Ahem, Bryce cleared his throat. "All right, I agree that you can travel with the troops. Is the lieutenant colonel telling the truth?" Bryce glared. "Would I, the battalion commander of the 1st Battalion, lie to you kids? You, on the other hand, tell me how you measure the distance." Yay, the students cheered, and their surveying work could continue. Although Joyce was now a battalion commander, he was still quite young, having been Schroeder's squire before. Seeing the students, who were a few years younger than him, cheering, he was deeply moved. He took out paper and pen and placed them on the table, smiling as he said to Nick, "Congratulations. Our Commander Bryce isn't usually so easy to talk to. But don't celebrate yet, give us a sneak peek first. If I'm not mistaken, it'll probably be using some kind of mathematics again, right?" Snap. Nick snapped his fingers and nodded. Indeed, he picked up the paper and began to draw. "This is a method we often use when surveying." Everyone leaned closer, and Nick drew a triangle on the paper. However, this triangle was a bit special. Two of its sides intersected perpendicularly, one exceptionally long and the other exceptionally short. The students all recognized it. It was a right triangle. "Let's assume your artillery is deployed here." Nick drew a circle at the right angle. Then he controlled the pen tip, slowly moving it from the right angle along the longer right-angled side, the line, towards the smaller acute angle, finally stopping at the tip. "This is your bombardment target." This line segment, Nick emphasized along right-angled side, the line, the pen tip had traversed, is the distance between the artillery and the target, and this line segment, Nick emphasized a shorter right-angled side, the line, is a known fixed distance to the side of the artillery. For ease of calculation, we can take an integer, such as 1 or 2 meters, we can call it the baseline. Now, by measuring this angle, Nick circled the larger acute angle, and combining it with this known fixed distance of 1 or 2 meters, we can measure the straight line distance between the artillery and the target. He heavily emphasized a long right-angled side, the line, several times. This is the line. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 291 Artillery Range Finding 2. A surveying team composed of students from Wyeth College followed the 1st and 3rd Battalions south, arriving at Byronburg and setting up camp on June 10. To quickly put pressure on the Kent family, the Arda Army's artillery soon began bombarding the castle. 2 battalions artillery units and an independent artillery battery lined up over 20 cannons, unleashing a barrage of fire on Byronburg. Commanding the Byronburg garrison was Sir Valentine, the Kent Knightmaster. He had received news of the Arda army's southward advance from the north and immediately dispatched a messenger to Sent. He had to hold Byronburg until his duke responded. After the First Battle of Bytoburg, the Arda army not only did not disband but also decisively occupied northern Emden, surprising the upper echelons of the Kent faction. Fortunately, the fortified Byronburg castle, with its high walls and deep moats, thwarted their attempt to occupy the entire Emden, much to the duke's relief. If the Kent family had lost their own ancestral home, they would have lost all face. Having half of it occupied was a huge embarrassment. Later, although a rebellion broke out in Arda, the Arda army stationed in Emden did not withdraw. The High Command of Sent reassessed Arden's strength. Besides the 1,000-plus troops in Emden, Gleman still maintained a considerable reserve force within his territory. In May, when the anti-tyrant alliance regrouped, the Gleman family was absent. The lords have sent to deduce that Gleman's remaining troops were hesitant to act due to the previous rebellion, and he was unwilling to relinquish northern Emden, so the 1,000-plus troops stationed there remained unmoved. Logically, the Kent family spies had only successfully instigated one riot, which was quickly quelled. How could they possibly hold back the entire remaining force in Arda? In reality, the spies didn't need to risk instigating repeated, genuine riots, they only needed to capitalize on the initial riot's impact. By casually releasing embellished fragments of events in the streets, taverns, and tea houses, the rumors would spread rapidly. Lakeside, once bitten, twice shy, guided by the principle of nipping danger in the bud, would immediately rush to investigate and establish martial law. Before the truth was revealed, how could they know what was true or false? After careful observation for over half a month, confirming that the Arda army remained inactive, the Duke's mansion devised a plan. After the mercenaries arrived from the south, they would defeat Earl Parker and other lords before Gleman could act, then concentrate their forces to deal with Gleman. What shocked the Duke's mansion, however, was that Gleman held more cards than anticipated. After only being bogged down for a month, he was able to stab them in the back, landing at Fishtail, a town on the upper reaches of the Weiss River. Of course, Sir Valentine had no time to concern himself with Fishtail. His immediate duty was to defend Byronburg. This was the ancestral home of the Duke's family. If it fell into enemy hands, even if the Duke didn't blame him, he would be utterly disgraced and would have no choice but to atone with his death. Sir Valentine had participated in the First Battle of Byronburg, and the Arda army had left a deep impression on him. Initially, when he was appointed to defend Byronburg, he attempted to organize troops to subdue northern Emden, but was quickly defeated by the power of the Thunderhammers and Fireballs. Sir Valentine always believed he was defeated by the overwhelming power of the Thunderhammers and Fireballs, even though the Arda army's Fireballs only fired one volley before charging in for hand-to-hand combat with bayonets. From that moment on, the Knight Commander resolved to remain in Byronburg without provocation, as long as the Arda army didn't provoke him. With his current force of less than 2,000 men, this was all he could do. He sought no merit, only to avoid trouble. However, the Knight Commander was quite confident in holding Byronburg. As the castle of the Kent family's patriarchs, its defensive capabilities were among the best in the entire Northwest Bay. Through the expansions of successive patriarchs, the castle walls reached a height of 12 meters and a width of 10 meters at the top. Unlike other castle walls that were merely covered with bricks and stones on the outside and rammed earth on the inside, Byronburg's walls were entirely constructed of massive stones. A wide moat surrounded the castle, and several deep trenches were dug outside the moat. The Arda army had attempted to attack Byronburg before, but the moat and trenches prevented mortars from being deployed close enough, forcing them to bombard it with 6-pound and 12-pound cannons with limited success. Now they were coming again. Nick and his classmates had built a rangefinder and were experimenting with it on the artillery position. A height-adjustable beam supported on the ground had a thin arm extending horizontally forward from each end. Viewed from directly above, one arm was fixed perpendicular to the beam, while the other could rotate left and right around the beam's endpoint. 2 points in a line, 2 points in a line. The artilleryman first aimed the fixed arm on the left side of the beam at the distant gate of Byronburg. Once the front and back ends of the fixed arm aligned with the gate, he considered it aimed. 2 points in a line. Muttering this, the artilleryman moved to the right side of the beam and gently moved the movable arm, trying to align its front and back ends with the gate as well. The beam was 1 meter long, the so-called baseline. Theoretically, measuring the angle between the movable arm and the beam would allow them to determine the straight line distance between the fixed arm and the target. However, reality deviated slightly from the theory. Targets nearby are relatively easy to measure, but as the target moves further away, a 1 meter shift to the left or right along the baseline yields no noticeable change in angle to the naked eye. "Excuse my bluntness, sir, but your device," the artilleryman involved in the test chuckled wryly, hesitating to finish. Nick scratched the back of his head and smiled awkwardly as well. He had calculated carefully that the tangent of an 89-degree angle is approximately 57.28996, meaning a 1 meter baseline would only allow a measurement of about 57 meters. The tangent of 1000 corresponds to an angle of 89 degrees 56 minutes and 34 seconds. The change in angle from 57 meters to 1000 meters is simply too subtle. It's impossible to measure with the naked eye and with the current rudimentary rotating arm. It truly echoes Earl Greyman's famous saying, "A small error can lead to a huge mistake." Joyce stood behind him, patting Nick on the shoulder. Don't be discouraged. This ranging method is theoretically feasible, and I believe it can be improved with some technology. He had crammed on trigonometry during the march and had complete faith in Nick's ranging method. Nick turned around and said, "Thank you, Mr. Joyce. I think we can increase accuracy by lengthening the baseline. 1 meter is too short. If we increase it to 15 meters, I think the accuracy should be sufficient for the current effective range of artillery." Joyce shook his head. 15 meters? Are you sure? It's too inconvenient to manufacture such a long beam, isn't it? We can disassemble this rangefinder into 2 parts, left and right, and use the same 2-point alignment method to ensure they are on the same straight line. Oh? Let's try it. Chapter 292. Jace gazed grimly at the walls of Biddleberg. The situation was more complicated than he had imagined. Thanks to excellent defenses, the Allied forces held the castle tenaciously. His troops attacked time and again, only to retreat each time. Besides the strategic location and formidable defenses, another crucial reason for the fortress's prolonged siege was the Allied forces' firearms finally beginning to prove effective. Jace had witnessed a new weapon, the hand grenade. As his soldiers approached the walls, dark objects were hurled down by the defenders and exploded. The grenades sprayed debris and nails, causing widespread casualties among the attacking troops. While not particularly powerful and not fatal, the explosion severely damaged morale. A bee sting won't kill, but nobody wants to disturb a beehive. Of course, the greatest damage came from the 4 Thunderhammers. He had learned from scouts that their official name seemed to be cannons. The catapults he brought were destroyed one by the concentrated fire of the defenders. Only God could predict where the stones launched from the catapults would land. In comparison, the accuracy of the Thunderhammer was far superior, relatively speaking. Even more terrifying was the Thunderhammer's power against siege infantry. When his soldiers were still far from the castle, the defenders attacked with solid shot, which was so deadly that a mere graze was fatal. Moreover, solid shot didn't just bounce off the ground, it would bounce several times. This was a terrifying, sustained killing force. Jace had witnessed it firsthand, a 100-man column approaching the castle, only to be struck squarely by a single cannonball. Even for a seasoned warrior like himself, the carnage still terrified him. If his commander was in such a state, his soldiers' morale was shattered. Jace was forced to take a day's rest to restore morale. As the besieging soldiers approached the castle, the defenders would switch to shotgun fire, another terrifying tactic. Accompanied by the booming of cannons, countless tiny projectiles flew at speeds imperceptible to the naked eye, creating a storm of metal. Each shot felled a large number of besieging soldiers. After being bombarded several times by the Thunderhammer, no one, from officers to soldiers, was willing to use close formations for sieges anymore. What made Jace even more uneasy was that the Thunderhammer's firing speed in this battle was much faster than in the Battle of Bitau Castle. He could tell from the sound alone. This meant that this terrifying weapon was constantly being improved. Good heavens, what would it be like next time? He turned to the mercenary captain beside him and asked, "Do you have any good ideas?" The mercenary captain shook his head. All military texts said that a siege should only be launched when the attacking force outnumbered the defending force tenfold. Such battles were all about killing, there were no good solutions. Otherwise, why would attackers often engage in widespread looting and even massacres after breaching a city? Firstly, they make promises to their soldiers before the attack to entice them to fight. Secondly, the siege causes enormous casualties, necessitating an outlet for the soldiers' anger. Jace unhappily turned his gaze back to Biddleberg. He intended for the mercenary force to participate in the attack, but the mercenary captain clearly didn't want to. The agreement signed with this mercenary group stipulated they would only be responsible for field battles. More clauses should have been added. The rumors were true, a bunch of guys who only cared about money and had no sense of honor whatsoever. "My lord, an urgent report from Emden." A knight rushed over, shouting to Jace. Jace was startled. What happened? Emden was his hometown. The thought of the Arda army entrenched in northern Emden filled him with unease. As expected, he guessed correctly. The knight put his hand to his ear and whispered, "The Arda army has launched an attack, bombarding Byronburg with Thunderhammers, and they're even trying to fill in the moat outside the castle. It seems they're serious." Jace's hand loosened, then tightened again on his whip. "Does anyone else know?" The knight shook his head and gagged. "The messenger has been confined, and he informed you first." Jace's expression relaxed. Very good. Immediately send that man back to Byronburg with my orders. I can't send reinforcements right away, but Valentine must hold it at all costs. The knight nodded. Yes, I'll send him back immediately, Jace instructed. Don't let anyone contact anyone. After replying don't worry, the knight whipped away. Jace watched his retreating figure in silence for a long time. The Arda army's unusual movements worried him greatly. Although Byronburg was exceptionally fortified, the enemy they faced this time was also quite unusual. Jace was unable to relieve Byronburg, and if he were to lead his army north, what if the enemy forces at Bittoburg reappeared? Would he then lead his army back again? Would that be like being led around by the nose? He frowned and summoned his squire, passed down the order. The first warrior to scale the city walls will be made a baron, the next 10 will be knights, and those already holding titles will be promoted one rank. The first 100 to scale the walls, regardless of rank, will each receive 1,000 gold coins. The order caused an uproar throughout the army. Just as Byronburg and Bittoburg were locked in fierce fighting, the Arda army, which had landed at Fishtail Town, began its southward advance. It took them 5 days to traverse the Carter family's territory. Viscount Solo Carter had clearly overestimated the family members' resolve to resist. Under the Arda army's onslaught, his relatives either fled or surrendered. Scattered, small-scale resistance occurred, but the key towns of the Viscountry quickly fell into Arda's hands. One wonders if the imprisoned Viscount was furious. On June 10, the Arda army entered the Northwest Duke's direct territory. Reconnaissance units discovered a large army approaching, numbering between 5,000 and 6,000 men. Apparently, the enemy had also spotted the Arda army, slowing their advance and sending out scouts to harass them. Chief of Staff Scrutter immediately ordered the vanguard to set up camp and await reinforcements. The landing force now extends far beyond the initial 2 battalions. Naval warships have made several trips, bringing not only large quantities of supplies but also 600 militiamen. These militiamen, armed with melee weapons, are responsible for maintaining order in the newly occupied areas, guarding key transportation points and supply depots, playing a crucial role. Furthermore, the Navy has also dispatched 300 men to assist the army, carrying muskets, cannons, and other weapons from the ships. Another major battle is about to erupt. Chapter 293. On the plains of the Duchy's border region, Schroeder's Arda army and the Ducal army faced off at a distance. He ordered his troops to form tight ranks and stand ready, deploying 2/3 of his artillery on nearby high ground. Once the enemy entered effective firing range, they were to open fire immediately to disrupt their formation. The Arda army was far outnumbered, and they couldn't allow the enemy to get too close in an attack formation. If the enemy doesn't move, we don't move. We'll wait for our rear troops to arrive before launching an attack, Schroeder instructed his officers, establishing this strategy. Opposite them, mercenary Captain Fergus was also observing his opponents from afar. He clicked his tongue in amazement as he observed rapid formation, impeccable discipline. Their sheer numbers far surpass those so-called armies in the Northwest Bay. No wonder you're so terrified. Emerson beside him gave a wry smile. Captain Fergus, perhaps you should stop with the sarcastic remarks and think about how to deal with this army. Fergus grinned. A good-looking formation isn't enough. On the battlefield, real skill matters. He waved his hand. Proceed according to plan. Cavalry. Enemy cavalry is charging towards us, an officer with binoculars shouted anxiously. This was the first time the 2nd and 3rd battalions had been deployed in direct combat against the Duke's army, and everyone was on edge. Schroeder ordered, don't panic. Order the artillery to fire and slow their advance. Infantry. Form squares to meet the enemy. With his command, the 2 infantry battalions quickly formed a large hollow square. A thunderous roar erupted as artillery on the hillside and near the square opened fire, bombarding the rapidly approaching cavalry with crossfire. Having learned their lesson, the Kent family cavalry were wiser this time. Instead of charging in a dense formation, they spread out widely, reducing the hit rate of solid shot. However, the casualties from the shelling were still considerable. Many men and horses were injured by bouncing shells. The cavalry quickly approached the phalanx, and the soldiers facing the enemy immediately opened fire. Shouts of battle, gunfire, and screams mingled on the smoke-filled battlefield. Wait until you're within 50 meters before firing. You bunch of bastards, Baron Andrew, commander of the Baradin Battalion, whipped his reckless soldiers in exasperation. The enemy cavalry had barely approached before these firearms novices nervously pulled the triggers. While the bullets were powerful enough at that distance, accuracy was still largely a matter of luck. The Berdan battalion's first firing yielded limited results. Andrew glanced at the 2nd Battalion on the other side. The number of enemies falling before them far exceeded those before his own lines, filling him with frustration. These guys have disgraced themselves, Earl Garnard, and Byron. The Duke's cavalry arrived in succession. Some knights, relying on their armored horses and men, charged into the phalanx with their lances. Many soldiers were sent flying by the lances, although they were equipped with breastplates produced by Northwest Industries, preventing the lances from piercing their flesh. The force was enough to severely injure them, if not kill them. The crackling of muskets echoed from within the phalanx, and cavalrymen approaching the formation fell to the ground, never to rise again. The Duke's army used a loose formation to approach the Arda army, which reduced the probability of being hit, but also greatly diminished the power of the charge. The cavalry charge had achieved little of note. Fergus and Emerson's faces were ashen. Many officers around them, facing the Arda army for the first time, were dumbfounded. In their minds, an infantry phalanx of this size would collapse with a single charge. They're definitely not an ordinary army. The mercenary captain's expression grew even more serious. Arrogance aside, he never underestimated any enemy, otherwise, he would have been eliminated long ago in the brutal course of combat. He looked towards the distant hillside, hoping everything was going well there. Cannons, where are the cannons? Why aren't they firing? The cavalry's charge and harassment lasted for nearly an hour before they retreated back to their starting positions, and the Arda army resumed their linear formation. Schroeder's tense nerves relaxed slightly, but his heart immediately tightened again. The cannons on the hillside had been silent for a long time, and an ominous premonition rose in his mind. Unfortunately, his premonition came true. A group of men ran down the hillside, and he immediately ordered his troops to provide support. The situation was clear. Schroeder was both shocked and furious. This was outrageous. There were 2 platoons guarding the artillery position. With their superior terrain and powerful firepower, what kind of enemy could possibly break through? Lord Schroeder, the position is lost, an artillery officer, his face flushed with shame, reported to him. Tim. Where is Tim? Step forward, the old knight roared in fury, looking around and calling out the name of the artillery commander. How dare they retreat without his orders? So many men had fled. The person responsible must be executed on the spot. Crucially, nearly 20 cannons remained on the position, handed over to the enemy. An officer, mustering his courage, whispered, The captain personally led the rear guard, and he's been killed." Schroeder fell silent. He couldn't vent his anger on the fallen. Moreover, artillery was a valuable, technically skilled branch of the military, and Tim's decision must have been based on that. After some questioning, he roughly understood what had happened. While the artillery on the hillside concentrated its fire on the cavalry, another enemy force, using the cover of the woods and tall grass, had quietly crept up to the vicinity of the high ground. It's longbowmen, definitely. They're ruthless, accurate, and have a high rate of fire. Many brothers have been hit, and the infantry defending the position were immediately suppressed. You have shotguns, right? Why didn't you use them at such close range? No one answered Schroeder's question. You speak. The old knight pointed at a lieutenant, his powerful roar startling the nearby soldiers. The lieutenant reflexively straightened his chest and loudly replied, reporting, "Sir. We didn't anticipate a large number of longbowmen coming, and we didn't transport enough shotguns to the high ground as per regulations." Schroeder was speechless. While the 1st and 3rd battalions were fighting fiercely outside, the 2nd and 4th battalions remained in Arda and Barden to guard the area. Their relatively comfortable lives had made them complacent. He needed to find time to rectify the military discipline, but the most important thing now was to reclaim the artillery positions. Firearms were the Arda army's greatest asset and couldn't be allowed to fall into enemy hands so easily. Fortunately, when the artillerymen retreated, they brought back the draft horses and the gunpowder, so the enemy could not immediately take away the artillery or obtain gunpowder samples to analyze. Chapter 294 Recapture the position. No, we must retake the high ground immediately. The cannons cannot fall into enemy hands. The old knight Schroeder made a decisive decision. Andrew, you command the 4th battalion to cover our rear. Claude, the 2nd battalion, follow me and charge the high ground. Andrew nodded silently without objection. Although he was a nobleman, he dared not be presumptuous in front of Schroeder, a knight. Claude, however, said worriedly, "Chief of Staff, our forces are still too few." "Perhaps, no." Schroeder waved his hand emphatically, insisting, "If we delay, they will tow the cannons away." Just as the two were discussing whether they should immediately counterattack the high ground, someone pointed north and shouted excitedly, "The troops behind are catching up." Everyone immediately looked north and saw a column winding its way towards the battlefield along the road. This was a sizable force composed of Arda sailors, militia, and auxiliary troops recruited from the Carter family's territory, numbering over 1,000. The sailors were equipped with cuirasses and muskets, while the militia were equipped with cuirasses and standardized long spears. The newly recruited auxiliary troops were only equipped with simple melee weapons, most of which were captured from the Carter family. A hint of joy finally appeared on Schroeder's face, just in time. "Tell them to speed things up." With a few whooshes, several rockets flew into the air and exploded. The troops in the distance saw the signal and began to rush towards them. The two armies met up. Commanding this force was the 3rd Fleet Commander, Tirpitz. He learned from Schroeder that the artillery positions had fallen into enemy hands and shrugged, saying, "Looks like we're a bit late. What do we do now?" "Take them back, Schroeder." "Of course, the artillery cannot fall into enemy hands." "Gentlemen, I just thought of something. The enemy has powerful longbows, such as a powerful ranged weapon. We need to draw well-protected soldiers from various units." A dozen minutes later, 600 soldiers had assembled. They were not only equipped with cuirasses but also helmets. Schroeder patted Andrew on the shoulder. "Baron, we entrust our rear to you." Andrew saluted him. "Rest assured, Chief of Staff. Also, please address me as Lieutenant Colonel." Schroeder nodded, drew his saber, pointed it at the high ground, and shouted, "Attack!" He took the lead and strode forward. Clang 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 clang, the marching drums sounded rhythmically. Behind Schroeder, 600 soldiers, divided into two groups led by Claude and Tirpitz respectively, followed Schroeder to the high ground, keeping time with the drum beats. The enemy on the artillery positions discovered the Arda army's counterattack. Still figuring out how to use the cannons, they immediately rallied, numbering about 1,000 from a distance, mostly longbowmen, but many also carrying spears and swords. When the Arda army was 200 meters away, the mercenaries' longbowmen began to fire, and a rain of arrows descended instantly. The attacking soldiers were equipped with breastplates and helmets, leaving their limbs exposed. This wasn't just to ensure troop mobility. Completely encasing each soldier like a knight in a metal can would be prohibitively expensive, even for Arda, whose revenue had skyrocketed. Arrows clattered against the armor, while those striking flesh produced screams of agony. Every few steps, soldiers would fall, groaning in pain. Some hit in vital areas might never walk properly again. However, they were fortunate compared to their contemporaries. Wounded soldiers were immediately carried to the rear on stretchers. In makeshift field aid stations, specialized medics treated them with clean bandages, boiled water, and sterilized surgical instruments, significantly increasing their chances of survival. The longbowmen in the Duke's army showed no pity for their screams, unleashing volleys of arrows. From their high vantage point, with a clear view, the Arda army became perfect targets. Humans, after all, are flesh and blood. Faced with such heavy casualties, even the Arda soldiers, rigorously trained in marching and drill, felt fear. The army's pace gradually slowed, and some soldiers' steps began to falter. The uncaptured cannons were not used to support the counterattack on the high ground, but instead to bombard the Duke's main force, which was launching another attack. Fergus and Emerson also noticed the Arda army's attempt to recapture the cannons. Their troops, having rested, launched another fierce attack, this time not only with cavalry, but also with infantry following behind. The artillery was positioned in front of the infantry ranks. The gunners performed exceptionally well, inflicting heavy casualties on the enemy. Once the cavalry closed in and ran out of volleys, they immediately abandoned the artillery and retreated into the infantry's square formation for cover. After one wave of attacks was repelled, they returned to their positions to operate the cannons. The arrival of reinforcements brought spears, but in resisting cavalry charges, spears proved more effective than rifles equipped with bayonets. The sounds of gunfire, battle cries, and the thunder of hooves filled the air. The two sides exchanged blows for several rounds, but the Duke's army could not break through Andrew's force of over 1,000 men. Schroeder frowned deeply. If this continued, the morale of his troops would collapse before they even reached the enemy. He stopped, turned, and looked at his soldiers, completely unconcerned about the arrows whizzing past behind him. Is this the end? Look at yourselves now. Are you even a tenth of your usual training performance? You're also weak and listless. From now on, people can laugh at us without restraint, calling us a showy but useless unit, the old knight lamented. The 1st and 3rd battalions faced the same longbowmen and the same attacks at Bitauberg, but they fearlessly marched in formation and fought back with bullets and bayonets. Show your courage and prove that we are heroes who are no less than them. Under Schroeder's repeated reprimands and provocations, many people showed shame and straightened their backs again. The old knight stopped his lecture at the right time. This was not a time for a long speech. He raised his sword again and pointed forward. Now I declare again, attack! Clang 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 clang. The marching drums sounded rhythmically again. Schroeder shouted with all his might as he marched forward. If I advance, you follow me. If I retreat, you execute me. If I die, you avenge me. These words seemed to ignite something within each soldier. Halt! Finally, they reached a point where they could clearly see the enemy's noses. Ready! The first rank of soldiers immediately knelt on one knee, while the second and third ranks alternated, pointing their guns forward. Fire! A deafening roar erupted. The simultaneous firing of 3-rank muskets created a terrifying spectacle, causing many enemy soldiers to tremble in fear. Even more terrifying was the sight of thick smoke rising as blackened gun barrels spat deadly flames, reaping lives in droves. Almost an entire rank of the Duke's army fell with a crash. A commotion erupted behind them. Schroeder brandished his sword. Kill, kill, long live. The soldiers behind echoed their commander, bayonets raised, and charged forward. Chapter 295. The battle on the high ground lasted for nearly half an hour. Senior officers such as Schroeder, Claude, and Tirpitz personally led their troops in hand-to-hand combat, finally recapturing the artillery positions. No matter how seasoned and experienced the mercenaries were, they couldn't withstand the close cooperation of the more than 600 Arda soldiers. Moreover, most of the mercenaries on the high ground were longbowmen, and close combat wasn't their forte. They were ultimately defeated. As for the ordinary soldiers sent to protect the longbowmen, they were terrified after witnessing the power of the Valley of Musket Fire. In Paul's design, his army wouldn't be based on elite troops, but rather on discipline and organization. Soldiers were to absolutely obey orders, even if those orders were not optimal or flawed. They didn't need to be proficient in every skill, but they needed to master their assigned skills. In battle, each soldier performed their duties, completing tasks through excellent collective organization, division of labor, and self-sacrifice, just like ants or bees. Of course, due to the limitations of the era, the so-called elite troops of this time weren't particularly elite. Therefore, the individual soldier quality of Arda was relatively high, surpassing most armies simply in terms of average literacy. In short, the Duke's army on the high ground faced a formidable opponent half a generation, or even a generation, ahead of them. Leaving behind a pile of wounded soldiers groaning on the ground, the Duke's army retreated back into the woods in the opposite direction from Arda's army. Schroeder ordered a rapid cleanup of the battlefield, with the primary task being to check the damage to the artillery. Fortunately, although there were signs of movement, not a single cannon had been taken away. They were all left on the position, although more than half of the cannon carriages were damaged. "Why didn't you move the cannons earlier?" Schroeder asked curiously, interrogating the wounded prisoners left on the position. Those Southerners, mercenaries, thought they'd seen all the weapons in the world and knew there was nothing they couldn't use, so they wanted to bombard you with those thunder hammers. But when they saw you attack and couldn't pull them away in time, they destroyed the supports. The prisoner's answer made Schroeder chuckle. Artillery was a weapon never before seen in history. Even if the mercenaries were well informed, how could they possibly operate it? Besides, the artillerymen had taken the gunpowder with them when they retreated. Immediately bombard the enemy with the intact cannons, and at the same time organize the artillery to repair the damaged gun carriages, Schroeder immediately ordered. Ferguson and Emerson were still anxiously awaiting news. Previously, they had sent an army to outflank the Alder where they had deployed the Thunderhammer. Overjoyed to see the flag indicating victory raised, they planned to use the troops on the high ground to attack the Alder from the front. However, a group of enemy soldiers spun off to the high ground. Ferguson, seizing the opportunity, ordered his rested troops to launch a second attack, either to annihilate the remaining enemy or force the enemy force that had counterattacked the high ground to return. What followed greatly disappointed Ferguson and Emerson. The Alder army remained steadfast. The cavalry and infantry attacking from the front continued to suffer casualties, and worse, their own flag on the high ground had fallen. Their back, a squire rushed in to report. Then a group of dejected, ashamed men approached Ferguson and Emerson. They knew the situation without being told. Ferguson asked coldly, "Where's the Thunderhammer?" The leading squad leader didn't dare raise his head, shaking it with his head drooping. Fergus was stunned, not a single one brought back. A long silence followed. "Useless," the mercenary captain roared, whipping his men mercilessly. "You've been up there for so long, couldn't you even spare a few men to bring back a few?" The squad leader, stung by the beating, tried to explain. "Lord Fergus, although the racks carrying the Thunderhammers have wheels, the Arda took all the horses from the Highlands during their retreat. These cunning creatures even locked the wheels. They couldn't go very far by manpower alone. We had to figure out how to use them to fight the Arda." Fergus stopped whipping, his face ashen, and asked, "What did you gain?" He had seen it clearly. After the mercenaries captured the Highlands, the Thunderhammers on the Highlands remained completely still. It was obvious his men hadn't found anything. "Oh, because their counterattack was so fast, we haven't figured out how to use them yet, but the braziers next to them clearly indicate they're related to fire." Fergus glared at him. "Do you need to talk nonsense? With that much smoke when they launched, do you think I'm blind?" The squad leader suddenly said hurriedly, "There's another important piece of information. There's a strong, strange smell permeating the Highlands. It smells like," he scratched his head, quickly recalling the smells he'd smelled before, then suddenly slapped his forehead and shouted, "That's it. It's sulfur. That strange smell must be the smell of burning sulfur." "Sulfur?" Fergus and Emerson asked simultaneously, exchanging a glance. Sulfur is a common ignition source, but even the most intense burning couldn't be connected to the earth-shattering sound of the Thunderhammer's launch. There must be something else. Emerson, seated on his horse, leaned down and asked, "Have you carefully examined the specific structure of the Thunderhammer?" The mercenary squad leader scratched the back of his head. "The structure is quite simple. It's just a large metal pipe, some made of bronze, some of iron. Once we return to camp, draw me a detailed diagram." "Yes, sir." Just as Emerson and the others were discussing the Thunderhammer, the Alda army launched an offensive, bombarding them with the remaining artillery. Many troops deployed at the front began to move backward without orders to avoid the whistling shells. Fergus and Emerson could both see that after the failed flanking maneuvers and multiple failed frontal assaults, the morale of the troops had plummeted to rock bottom. "Damn it, this is the first time I've encountered such a small but tough opponent," Fergus grumbled inwardly. In his previous wars, he'd faced formidable opponents before, but that was always when the forces were roughly equal. Today, even with reinforcements, his forces outnumbered the enemy 3-1. And yet, he'd ended up with such a humiliating defeat. Fergus looked north. The Alder were moving in a line formation, their disciplined ranks creating the illusion from a distance, not as individuals, but as a moving wall, exuding an oppressive aura. "Lord Emerson," the mercenary captain's voice lacked its previous arrogance. Emerson nodded reluctantly. "Sigh, let's retreat." The battle on the duchy's border had finally come to an end. Chapter 296 War Bonds. Just as the soldiers of the Arda army were fighting a bloody battle on the front lines. Oh, to have a cool and aloof female scholar, who was also a legendary powerful witch, do this, was truly fulfilling. He slightly raised his head, meeting a pair of bright, lively eyes, as she pounded her legs with her two small pink fists. Betty Diaz, a descendant of a noble family from the Gabella Empire, shyly turned her head away after meeting his gaze, pouting. "Really, I've never done this before," he chuckled, reaching out to gently stroke her beautiful blonde hair. "Ah, what a decadent and corrupt life. Count. The world suddenly shook, and the scene before him began to blur. What was happening? Paul shook his head. When he came to his senses, the bright, clear eyes from before had transformed into thick, large eyes. "Bernard. It's you." Paul nearly jumped up from his chair, staring at the man before him. "Where's Laddie? Where's Betty?" The chief secretary apologized profusely. "Lord Gleman, I'm sorry to disturb your rest. The two ladies are here. Shall we continue the meeting?" Of course. Paul remembered that he had arranged to discuss recent work progress with the heads of various departments, and he had actually dozed off halfway through. After thinking it over carefully, he realized it was all that damned Hansel's fault. Every time this guy reported to him, he used an incredibly long, convoluted, and rhetorically complex sentence structure. A single word could be stretched into a sentence, and a sentence could be expanded into a long paragraph. He had to use every brain cell to decipher what Hansel was saying. At this moment, Hansel had finished his seemingly century-long report. Paul glanced into the room. Laddie and Betty were sitting not far away. The witch's face was expressionless as she looked down at her notebook. The female supervisor looked at Paul with disgust. Honestly, how old are you? Drooling while dozing off, and what do you mean by calling us ladies by our names as soon as you wake up? She secretly gestured to the corner of her mouth. Paul took out a handkerchief to wipe his mouth and coughed. Excuse me, I've been a bit tired lately. What's next? Old Ford, the Grand Steward of the State Council, spoke up. Lord Gleman, I must discuss the finances with you. Paul held his forehead and said painfully, don't tell me we don't have enough money. Unfortunately, that's the reality. May's expenses reached over 8,000 silver coins. Even with your private treasury, our money is almost gone. Since the Salt Peasant Uprising, security expenses have increased significantly due to the expansion of the Ministry of Public Security and the Internal Guard. Since the formal commencement of hostilities with the Kent family, military expenditures have become the bulk of Arden's budget. After the landing at Fishtail, to meet the manpower needs on both fronts, Paul generously sent nearly 2,000 militiamen to the battlefield through conscription stations across the country. He also approved Schroeder's plan to recruit auxiliary troops locally. Since it was war, they couldn't go empty-handed. Corresponding weapons and equipment had to keep up. The soldiers needed food and drink, and a little alcohol before battle for a boost. Paul strictly forbade his troops from using plunder to solve their supply problems, unless he himself was desperate. At this point, Arda possessed a military force of nearly 6,000 men. If not for his shrewdness in making money, Paul would undoubtedly be the most extravagant and wasteful lord in the history of the Griles family. The money spent daily on such a massive army seemed like water to the old man of the lord's mansion, like old Ford and Philip. I don't understand. Our territory has expanded so much. We've almost taken over the entire northern part of Emden, and now the Carter family's territory is almost all occupied by us. Can't the tax revenue from these places balance out a portion of it? Your Excellency, the situation I've described to you has already taken this part into account. Of course, the members of the Council of State did not intend to leave the tax revenue from these occupied territories to the former owners. My lord, I have a suggestion. Hansel? Speak quickly. Actually, you could save a lot of money if you just stopped giving the soldiers any allowances. Like other lords, serving in the army for their lord is the duty of the subjects. Hansel's words were met with agreement from many, but Paul immediately shook his head. No. Absolutely not. Material incentives are an important means of maintaining morale. Our series of victories recently have proven that giving the soldiers allowances was the right thing to do. Look at any other army, which one can fight as well as ours. If it's about material incentives, there are other methods, the ones everyone commonly uses. No. That's even more unacceptable. Before Hansel could finish speaking, Paul knew what he was going to say. How could he tolerate his painstakingly trained army degenerating into a bunch of bandits? Seeing that nothing seemed to work for the Earl, Hansel tried another tactic. Your Excellency, if I remember correctly, a stock exchange is being planned for Port Franklin, isn't it? Paul nodded. Yes, it's a plan that was decided long ago, as you know. Hansel continued. In that case, why not issue war bonds through the stock exchange? This would raise funds for the war effort and boost the exchange's business, a win-win situation. This, to start making money right after its establishment, isn't that a bit much? What's wrong with that? Isn't it common for kings and lords to borrow money for war? As far as I know, the Gleman family has never defaulted on a loan, and with the army advancing triumphantly, there's no shortage of people buying the bonds. Besides, Hansel paused, lowering his voice, this way, we can test the wealthy people in the territory, to see who is truly loyal to you and who isn't. Anyway, those who buy the bonds certainly don't want you to fail. Paul suddenly understood. You're right, Hansel. Then he hesitated. What if the war drags on too long and we can't repay the debts? Hansel, given the current situation, we'll be spending more than we earn sooner or later. It's better to raise a large sum of money quickly, manufacture more muskets and cannons, and take Sense City as soon as possible. I've heard that the Ferdinand family's wealth is the greatest among the lords of the Northwest. If you seize the Northwest Duke's treasury before anyone else, Are you worried about not being able to repay the debt? But what if, unfortunately, the treasury doesn't have as much money as rumored? Those rich people are not like the penniless salt farmers. They'll cause more trouble if they rebel. Hansel smiled slightly. What's there to be afraid of? Haven't you also manufactured more muskets and cannons? Chapter 297. After further discussion, everyone agreed that issuing war bonds was a good idea, so Paul assigned the task to Old Ford and Hansel. As the meeting was drawing to a close, a young officer rushed in and handed Paul a copy of the latest battle report from the front. Oh, Paul shook his head as he read it. We've encountered a tough battle. With a sorrowful expression, he passed one of the reports around for everyone to read. This report, written by Scrutter, detailed a battle that had taken place on the duchy's border. Although the Arda army had won the battle, killing and capturing over 1,000 enemies, they had also suffered nearly 300 casualties. Scrutter estimated that the final casualties due to death or serious injury would exceed 100. This was the first time Paul had encountered a situation where his army had lost so many men in a single battle. Such things are ultimately unavoidable. The enemy won't hand over victory so easily. My lord, you should focus more on the significance of this victory than on the casualties. As a lord, you'll get used to this sooner or later. Seeing the expression on Paul's face, everyone assumed he was shocked by the casualty figures, so they offered words of comfort. After all, this lord was still so young. Paul took a deep breath and said seriously, I hope the army will do a good job in providing compensation, and we must not let the families of the fallen soldiers feel disheartened. Ron, Kelly, and other senior officers who remained in Lakeside Town quickly wrote down the Lord's words. The report also mentioned that because of the heavy casualties in this battle, Schroeder had to suspend the offensive for a period of time, allowing the troops to rest and recuperate in the border region where they were currently located, and recruit more locals to supplement their fighting strength. Of course, if the Duke's army launched another offensive, they would absolutely not back down. Paul had no objection to this. He was not someone who was eager for victory. Information from Beacon's castle indicates that Jace seems to have gone all in, attacking the castle regardless of casualties. Clearly, the pressure from Emden and the upper reaches of the Weiss River has put him on the verge of collapse. This Duke's son could never have imagined that Sir Brett Sean, the master of Beacon's castle, to avoid being held accountable by the Kent family for surrendering to the Allied forces after their victory, would proactively reveal a secret his family had kept for generations, an underground tunnel within the castle, its exit located in a hidden ravine to the west of the castle. As for why he didn't slip away quietly during the last battle, it was partly because he was unwilling to abandon the wealth accumulated by his family over generations. A stealthy escape would certainly require traveling light. Secondly, the exit was located to the west of the castle, making Beethoven a thorn in the side between Portree and Arad, both key members of the anti-Kent alliance. If Sir Sean wanted to escape, the north, west, and south were all enemy territory. The shortest route to safety would be to quietly bypass Beethoven and head east. However, the Allied forces were heavily fortified to the east of the castle to prevent the Duke's army from rescuing Beethoven, making such an escape route even more dangerous. In short, escaping from here was not a wise move. To avoid being discovered by Allied patrols, Sir Sean also had a considerable length of the tunnel near the exit blocked. Thirdly, Maltz Kent had ordered him to hold this crucial transportation hub, even implying that failure would result in suicide. Under these circumstances, Sir Sean's attempt to slip away quietly would be disastrous. To hell with Maltz, to hell with the Duke of the Northwest. After Jace's first failed attempt to relieve the siege, Sir Sean immediately sent envoys to negotiate a unified surrender with the Allied forces. After Jace led his troops to besiege Bidoberg for the second time, to avoid being punished by the Duke for surrendering, Bright Sean decisively revealed the underground tunnel. The Allied forces then cleared the exit, and this narrow tunnel became the lifeline for the garrison inside the castle. Weapons, equipment, medicine, reinforcements, and even gunpowder, shells, and grenades from Lake Town were continuously transported into the castle. Paul was overjoyed. Bidoberg was a meat grinder. Let Jace enjoy it. Arda would gradually accumulate strength on the upper reaches of the Vis River, launching a direct attack from their rear on Sent, the capital of the Northwest Duchy. If this fortress ultimately fell, of course, that would be a terrible thing. If Jace could just push one more step and reach the west coast, he could divide the entire alliance into north and south. However, according to the General Staff's analysis, The pressure from Emden and the upper reaches of the Vis River was enough to halt the Duke's army's advance. Jace's hasty attack on Bittoburg was less about capturing it as a forward base for continued attacks and more about using it as a western barrier against enemy counterattacks, allowing him to free up troops to deal with the Arda forces from other directions. If the fortress did fall and Jace acted more recklessly than anticipated, Arden's land route to the south would be cut off. At that point, transporting goods or aiding allies isolated in the south would depend solely on the already sizable naval fleet. Losing a crucial transportation hub wouldn't immediately collapse the alliance. The lords and generals stationed at Bittoburg wouldn't perish with the castle, but would escape through tunnels back to their own territories to continue organizing their armies. And what would happen next, who could say? War is, after all, a gamble. Perhaps the two sides would eventually reach a stalemate and shake hands in peace. But as long as it wasn't the worst-case scenario, a complete defeat for the alliance, leaving them vulnerable and at the mercy of others, Alda would gain a foothold in the Northwest Bay, becoming a significant force. Gleman would also shed the previous image as an obscure, exiled family and achieve a status befitting their high-ranking noble title of Earl. "I'm getting a little excited just thinking about it," Paul blurted out, leaving everyone bewildered. Then the Earl received another piece of news that deeply surprised him. The surveying team in Emden had invented a rapid distance measurement method for the artillery, based on the trigonometric functions he had taught at school. Two conflicting emotions welled up within him. One was the joy of being both lord and teacher. My God, had his long-term investment in education finally borne fruit? He had only explained the application of trigonometric functions in surveying. He hadn't expected anyone to apply them to military matters. The other was a strange sense of loss. Damn, why didn't I think of this? I'd missed a golden opportunity to show off in front of the soldiers. Of course, the former sentiment prevailed. After all, it was a good sign. Technological progress and industrialization couldn't rely solely on his limited knowledge. More people needed to speculate, think, prove, and apply. Paul believed that similar things would become more frequent in the future. The meeting ended soon afterward. After everyone dispersed, Paul stood by the office window for a long time, gazing outside. Finally, unable to suppress a certain impulse, he sat down at the desk. Muttering to himself, "The aura of a prophet is still quite necessary at this stage," he picked up his pen and wrote down some ideas on using lens equipment for long-distance measurement. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 298. Beto Castle ultimately fell. Under the cover of night, the lords set up makeshift torches and flags on the walls and quietly withdrew through the underground tunnels. At dawn, the Duke's army began preparing for the new day's attack, with Jace commanding from the front, his eyes bloodshot. He had only slept a few hours the previous night. In the dead of night, the troops on guard west of the castle ran to report that faint lights had appeared further west. The officer on patrol dared not be careless and personally rode to the main camp to report. Jace, suppressing his anger at being woken up, carefully inquired, "Are you sure it was enemy reinforcements?" "I can't be sure, the distance is too far, and they disappeared immediately, but I think it's better to be cautious." "You did a good job. Notify all battalions to be on alert." Jace had to be extremely vigilant. What normal person would travel in the dead of night? If their side were caught off guard and ambushed by the enemy, it would be disastrous. Most of the soldiers, being of civilian origin, couldn't see well at night. Awakened by the noise, they could only grab their weapons and hack and slash indiscriminately, friend or foe. The repeated defeats of the previous days had exhausted the troops, and a rout could easily occur. Thus, the entire army spent a tense night. At dawn, to restore morale, Jace ordered a feast, and the soldiers ate their fill before beginning a new day's attack. However, they discovered that the thunder hammers, which usually struck fear into the hearts of all, were silent. The attacking soldiers slowly approached the castle, pushing heavy shield carts. This defensive measure was quite effective against cannon fire at long range and could also protect against deadly shrapnel at close range, provided they weren't destroyed along the way. They were trembling with fear, their hearts pounding, yet they heard no thunder hammer roars along the way. Accustomed to advancing alongside cannon fire, the sudden disappearance of this pressure only fueled their unease. Could the people inside the castle be preparing something even more insidious? The vanguard finally approached the gate, but no grenades rained down to greet them. They finally noticed something amiss. The figures on the city wall appeared to be made of straw. Did the people inside escape? With this thought in mind, some daring soldiers scaled the wall. Sure enough, besides them, there was no one inside. The enemy has retreated. We can take Brittleburg. Hearing the news of his victory, Jace was both amused and exasperated. A massive campaign, over a month's worth of casualties, and this was all he got? From the outcome, he had indeed won, but it looked like a victory handed over by the enemy. No prisoners of war kneeling in surrender, no dejected generals. This victory was utterly unsatisfying. He had troops stationed on all four sides of the castle. How had they escaped under cover of night? There must be a hidden secret within the castle. Jace ordered his troops to thoroughly search every corner of the castle, and finally discovered a tunnel leading underground in a warehouse. He sent men into the tunnel to search, and they returned an hour later, demonstrating its length. The returning soldiers said the path was blocked halfway through. There must be an exit to the west of the castle. The Duke's son was furious. And they must have been using this tunnel to transport large quantities of supplies during this time. Right, Sean, you bastard. The Duke's son's angry roar seemed to echo throughout the castle. The tunnel was long and well fortified. Such a scale of construction indicated it couldn't have been dug hastily. It must have been dug and maintained by the Sean family for generations to prepare for emergencies. Meanwhile, Paul was also frustrated upon learning of the abandonment of Beacon Castle. He had thought his allies could hold out longer. I sent them so much weaponry and supplies, including 8 rapid-fire cannons, and we haven't even equipped ourselves with many, but there was nothing he could do about it. He could only remind the 2 battalions stationed in Emden to keep a close watch on the enemy's movements. Another thing that made him wary was a secret letter from Scrutter, which mentioned that in the battle on the border of the duchy, the enemy had outflanked and secretly reached and occupied the artillery positions. Although the Arda army immediately counterattacked and recaptured the positions, and all the cannons were intact, the enemy had been in close contact with the cannons and might have come into contact with residual gunpowder. The enemy might be able to deduce some information about the gunpowder, but Paul wasn't worried that they could immediately reverse engineer the real gunpowder. Even if they generally knew that gunpowder contained saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal, they couldn't immediately test the optimal ratio. It's worth noting that in his previous life, as the country that invented gunpowder, China, lacking rigorous chemical knowledge, hadn't figured out the optimal ratios for various gunpowders even by the late Qin dynasty, and could only rely on the experience of its craftsmen to produce gunpowder of inconsistent quality. To manufacture high-quality gunpowder, a series of complex processes are required, including crushing, mixing, pressing, drying, and polishing. Since Paul invented gunpowder, the arsenal has been relentlessly researching and experimenting with techniques to improve the purity of saltpeter and sulfur, and how to safely grind gunpowder. They have developed dozens of processes and made subtle adjustments to the proportions of raw materials according to different uses. Although the Northwest Bay is not lacking in saltpeter mines, the method of refining saltpeter is still the primitive boiling method. As the saying goes, 1,000 days of boiling saltpeter is not as effective as a single shot from a general. How to increase saltpeter production has always been a headache for Paul. To obtain saltpeter, he even sent people to scrape toilets from house to house. This is one of the reasons why he strictly forbids urination and defecation in public places. Toilets are a source of fighting power, even if the quantity is small, every little bit counts. Paul does know the principle of using nitrifying bacteria and rice fertilization to build saltpeter fields for large-scale saltpeter production, but while the principle is one thing, figuring out a feasible operation will take time. Arda's demand for saltpeter was so great that it couldn't be kept secret from those who wanted it, so instead of trying to keep the gunpowder formula a secret, it was better to spread some misleading information. Paul consulted with Old Ford, the chief of staff of the State Council, and Cecil from the Intelligence Department. With the weather getting hotter recently, he planned to build several ice factories. Old Ford was shocked. Sir, although we're not as strapped for cash as we were a couple of years ago, there aren't many wealthy people in Lakeside Town buying our ice. It's definitely a losing proposition. Well, whether it makes money or not is secondary. I mainly want to use it as a cover. Paul explained his intentions to them. Ford, the chief steward, nodded. It sounds like it might work, but it'll cost a fortune. We can't let people immediately see it's just an empty shell." Seeing that the chief steward had agreed, Paul then instructed Cecil, "You need to spread some false information, making the gunpowder formula as confusing as possible. Also, try to find a source, like extracting it from seawater. Leave it to me, Your Excellency." "Spreading rumors is easy," Cecil said confidently, accepting the task. Chapter 299. Andy approached the Duke's study with trepidation. The servant standing at the door, seeing the young mage arrive, gestured for him to wait a moment before turning and entering the study. The servant quickly returned, bowing slightly to Andy. "Please come in, His Majesty the Duke is waiting for you inside." Andy swallowed hard, straightened his collar, pushed open the half-closed door, and entered the Duke's study. The door clicked shut by the servant outside. A wave of bewilderment washed over him. Andy then realized the room was pitch black. Thick curtains blocked the windows, allowing only a sliver of light to filter through. By this faint light, Andy could vaguely sense someone sitting beside the desk. "Ken. Duke Kent?" Andy asked cautiously. "Andy, my young friend," the seated person spoke. For some reason, Andy only now felt that he was a living being. The voice belonged to Malps Kent Ferdinand, the new Duke of the Northwest Bay of the Kingdom of Alder, or, as his enemies would say, a usurper. Unlike his powerful voice in public, the Duke's voice was now very low, like the growl of a beast, sending chills down one's spine. "Sit down," Andy, enduring the intense discomfort in both his body and mind, groped for a chair nearby and sat down. "Thank you, Your Grace. May I ask what brings you here?" The Duke did not speak, but stood up and slowly rose from his seat, 2 points of light moving with him. Those were the Duke's eyes. "So, he's still researching Master Barnett's blood therapy?" Sigh, the young mage shook his head inwardly. The Duke was probably already deeply entrenched in that secret technique. A beam of light burst from the darkness as the Duke lit a candle. He turned to look at the young mage. Andy also saw the Duke clearly, and the muscles in his face twitched. The Duke's physique remained robust, but his appearance was truly terrifying. His facial skin was a sickly pale white, his sunken eye sockets were bloodshot, radiating a chilling light, and his lips were a vivid crimson, as if smeared with blood. The Duke slowly approached him, his footsteps making no sound. Andy shifted uncomfortably, recalling the horrific legends surrounding blood therapy. Maltz reached out and touched Andy's face, a sinister smile playing on his lips as he made a stroking motion. "What a young body, what vibrant blood!" A series of incomprehensible whispers drifted over, as if desperately craving something, sending shivers down Andy's spine. He barely managed to suppress his trembling. "Your Grace," the young mage frowned. The Duke, who had been staring blankly at Andy's neck, immediately withdrew his hand. "I apologize, young friend, for letting you see me in private, but there shouldn't be any secrets between us." Maltz maintained his smile and slowly strolled back to his seat. He spread his hands and said casually, "I need help, you know. I've run into some trouble on the battlefield lately." The young mage knew what trouble the Duke was in. Last year, the Arcane Society, specifically, the order left by Master Barnett before his departure, sent him to the Northwest Bay to assist then Count Maltz Kent. Through some kind of mental magic, Maltz Kent had taken control of the then Duke of the Northwest, making the old Duke choose him as his successor. After the old Duke's death, he would naturally become the new Duke of the Northwest. Just as they were about to proceed according to Master Barnett's plan, an unexpected event occurred. The old Duke's brother escaped from his strict confinement and published a handwritten letter written by the old Duke when he was lucid, accusing Maltz of manipulating witchcraft and usurping the throne, even though he was indeed manipulating witchcraft. The lords of the Northwest Bay, supporting and opposing the new Duke, soon split into two factions, and the entire northwest region of the Kingdom of Alder was plunged into chaos. The outbreak of war disrupted Maltz's plans, but initially he was confident that he could suppress the rebellion within a year. However, an unexpected event occurred. Like a hunter pecking at the eye, he was ultimately robbed of his own. The goose that pecked at the Duke's eye was the Gleman family of Arda. If the Northwest Bay was considered a remote and impoverished region, then the Earldom of Arda was the most remote of those remote regions. Yet, this very region had suddenly begun to rise to prominence a year and a half ago. In this war, the strange weapons, the disciplined military formations, and the obedient soldiers were the main enemy factors that had led Maltz's army into this predicament. The war, which had dragged on from the beginning of the year until July, had reached a stalemate, and the new Duke's faction was being attacked from both the front and rear. The one stirring up trouble in the rear was none other than Paul Gleman. The Duke had instigated internal strife in Arda, and he had recruited mercenaries from the south, but neither had prevented his side from gradually declining. Maltz had once suspected that the Arcane Society might also be secretly assisting Grylls, making them fight each other to the death, leaving the strongest as a proxy, like the legendary practice of raising poisonous insects. Andy hesitated and said, "Your Grace, I only know a little bit of mental magic. How can I help you?" "Oh, young friend, I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about the organization behind you, the Arcane Society. Send a message to our," he emphasized the word we, "companions. I need help." After spending so much time together, Maltz had also learned about Andy's abilities. He was indeed not as powerful as he had imagined. This made him very disheartened by the Arcane Society, which he had once admired so much. To send such a weak mage to assist him, it should at least be a powerful figure like Master Barnett. But, I have no influence in the organization. Has the Arcane Society already abandoned me?" Before Andy could finish speaking, a hysterical roar was heard, accompanied by a crash. The table next to the Duke's seat shattered into pieces. He had been resting his hand on that table, motionless. "What strength?" Andy was startled, and looked at the Duke with even greater fear. His aura was now that of a ferocious beast ready to devour its prey, his mouth stretched into a grotesque shape, his long, sharp canines exposed without any concealment. The young mage's heart leaped into his throat. What kind of monster had Master Barnett left behind? I will send a message. I will try my best to persuade them." Maltz Ferdinand finally regained his previous smile, as if his earlier outburst had never happened. For the Arcane Society, he raised a tall glass and drank the crimson liquid inside in one gulp. Chapter 300. The carriage moved at a leisurely pace through the streets of Fland Harbor. The skilled driver maneuvered the horses, ensuring a smooth ride with only slight bumps. Bennett Todd sat inside, eyes closed, inwardly praising the carriage. He thought to himself, as expected of a carriage made by the Lakeside Machinery Factory. "The incredibly comfortable shock absorption system is a real treat. My backside is perfectly comfortable." He'd heard that the shock absorption system was personally developed by the factory's director, Guy Burns, a highly skilled mechanic recruited from the capital, Crystal Glory, by the Lord. After leisurely experiencing his new ride for a while, Bennett turned his attention to his recent business. With the support of the State Council's policies promoting industry and commerce, Bennett didn't rush to invest in the various emerging industries advocated by Earl Paul Gleman like other businessmen. Instead, he continued with his old trade, shipping. In any industry, goods produced must eventually be sold. The Northwest Bay has always been impoverished. Although the Lord is committed to improving people's livelihoods, this is not a matter of a year or two. Currently, the common people don't have much spare money to buy non-essential goods. Due to the numerous land transportation barriers of this era, sea transport will become the only option for long-distance, large-scale transportation. As long as he focuses on his old profession, he won't have to worry about making money. Sure enough, the State Council soon announced that the Franklin Port Shipyard would launch civilian-type sailing ships, much to the delight of the Todd family. Having already experienced a trip to South Cape Bay from the Quake shipyard, Bennett was quite confident in the all-sailing ship. However, the shipyard's prices were shockingly high. 3,000 silver coins for a single-masted ship and a whopping 5,000 silver coins for a double-masted ship. Adding anti-piracy ballistae would further increase the price. At that time, the stock exchange had not yet officially opened, making fundraising very inconvenient. Just as Mr. Todd was hesitant due to the high prices, the shipyard, with the patronage of Earl Gleman, introduced a convenient measure for cash-strapped ship owners: installment payments. The money didn't have to be paid in full at once. After signing the contract, a down payment could be made, with the remainder paid in installments. This measure was incredibly convenient, rekindling Mr. Bennett's hopes. The Todd family quickly raised funds and placed an order with the shipyard before other competitors. The Todd family was the largest ship owner in the area, and with their lead, other ship owners followed suit. In the first half of this year, Mr. Bennett finally received a sloop and a brigand, immediately putting them into business. The civilian-type vessel had increased cabin capacity, slightly less maneuverable than a warship, but more suitable for carrying cargo. In Paul's eyes, this type of vessel was very similar to the Clark sailing ships of Earth's history. If the shipyard manager Reuben wasn't exaggerating, a brigand could carry 60 to 70 tons. Good heavens, this is incredible. Yes, some large galleys are superior to these wind-driven ships, but they require hundreds of oarsmen, while these new vessels only need the wind. The actual performance of these two ships in his business proved that buying them was an absolutely worthwhile investment. Bennett loved them to death. He even personally sailed to Cape Point on the larger brig to witness firsthand the prosperity of the South, a vast world that had previously only existed in his imagination. Bennett also visited the Foster family with a letter of introduction from the Lord's Manor, confirming their business partnership, something he had never dared to dream of before. He had already planned to continue ordering more sailing ships to replace the family's existing galleys. "Sir, we've arrived," the coachman's words interrupted Bennett's rosy reverie. So fast, he opened his eyes, stepped down from the carriage, and instructed the driver, "I'll get off first. You don't need to wait for me outside. Just come pick me up at the agreed time." A tavern came into view. After the driver drove away, Bennett went inside. He introduced himself and was led to a room by a waiter. Many people were already seated inside, all prominent figures from various trades in the area: paper makers, porcelain makers, canneries, among whom he knew best was the salt merchant, Godwin. These people had one thing in common: they had multiplied their wealth several times over under the State Council's policy of supporting industry and commerce and technology sharing. Well, Bennett himself was one of them. "Ha, Bennett, you've finally arrived. Everyone's been waiting for you." Godwin stood up to welcome him to a seat. Bennett gave an apologetic look. I'm sorry, my ship just brought back a batch of Eastern spices from Cape Bay. I have to go check them out myself." "Damn, Eastern spices." Everyone inwardly scoffed. The most lethal form of arrogance is often subtle. After some pleasantries, they finally got to the main topic of the gathering, discussing the war bonds issued by the State Council. Godwin raised his voice and asked, "What are your thoughts on the war bonds?" Well, no one gave a direct answer, they only discussed it in small groups. The group gradually split into two factions. One favored buying the bonds, of course, within their means. The other believed it was best to stay out of it. An older merchant, stroking his graying beard, shook his head and said, "Logically, it's our duty as commoners to help the Lord resolve his predicament, but, someone beside him continued, "But we are also small-scale merchants with meager profits, we are truly willing but unable." Their words resonated with many. "Yes, we are merely merchants, how can we get involved in the disputes of noble lords?" Their view was immediately countered. "HMPH, you are truly ungrateful." "What? How can you say that? Think about the lives you lived before, and look at yourselves now, riding in luxurious carriages, wearing exquisite clothes. Small-scale merchants with meager profits? That's laughable. Everyone knows we've made a fortune thanks to the Earl's favor." The two sides argued endlessly, each holding their own ground. Why gather to discuss this matter? Many who opposed buying bonds thought, what if the Earl loses the war after buying bonds? Would the money be wasted? It's safer to just do business honestly. But if I don't buy, and someone else does, the Earl will only make things difficult for me. It's best if no one buys. Those who support buying bonds think, what if the Earl loses? I can't let my money go down the drain, everyone should lose money. In short, most people persuaded the other side with the idea that in an extreme situation, they shouldn't be the only one to suffer. "Ahem, gentlemen," Godwin stood up and spoke. He was inclined to buy bonds. Everyone should think long-term. Everyone looked at him. Looking across the Northwest Bay, which nobles territories as friendly to merchants as Alda, this was true, and everyone nodded in agreement. Not only in the Northwest Bay, but merchants in the Kingdom of Aldo were all easy prey in the eyes of those in power. What if the Earl loses? May God forgive my disrespect, and the Kent family gains power. Will we still have our good days? A chill ran through everyone. Mounts Kent was a ruthless man. If Earl Gleman can retain his lands, that's fine, we'll just share some of the war reparations. But what if the worst happens, the Earl's lands are taken away, and a new lord comes in? Do you want to go back to those days of endless taxes and levies, those dark and hopeless times? This was a blow to the soul, and many in the room instinctively shook their heads. After Paul Gleman ascended the throne, he gradually abolished all sorts of miscellaneous taxes and levies, enjoying a comfortable year or so, as if life should always be this way. Actually, if you compare it to the past, everyone pays more taxes than before, but that's on the premise that they're also earning more. Bennett watched Godwin, who was earning a lot of effort to persuade the crowd, without saying a word. He was puzzled. His old friend, who was usually so reserved, was suddenly so enthusiastic. After much thought, a flash of inspiration struck Bennett. Hell, looks like someone beat him to it, he had to act quickly. Moreover, he also thought Godwin's words made a lot of sense. Since his trip to Cape Cod, Bennett's horizons had broadened considerably. While envying the wealth of the South, a sense of inferiority always lingered in his heart. However, he believed he could achieve what the Cape Cod giants did, but this required the right environment. A sapling can only grow into a great tree in the right environment. He couldn't let that environment be destroyed. Having made up his mind, Bennett stood up. Gentlemen, please hear me out. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.